Hi everyone, we are Nightmare Narratives and we are here to help you today. I know you will use this video to fall asleep before, so like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It was a quiet evening and the soft hum of the baby monitor had become background noise, just like the ticking of a clock or the gentle creaks of the house settling. Emily sat in the living room, flipping through a magazine while her newborn, Lucy, slept upstairs. The monitor was perched on the coffee table, displaying the familiar static-filled silence of a peacefully sleeping baby. The house, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood, had always felt safe to Emily and her husband James. They had moved in just before Lucy was born, eager to start their new chapter as a family in a place that offered tranquility and space to grow. The home was old, but its charm, vintage hardwood floors, high ceilings, and a sprawling backyard, had drawn them in immediately. It was perfect for the life they envisioned. But tonight there was something different in the air. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the quietness wasn't quite right. She glanced at the baby monitor, the small green light flickering with every soft exhale of Lucy's breath. Her daughter was sleeping soundly, as she had been for the past hour, but the sense of unease gnawed at Emily's mind. She brushed it off as new mother anxiety, a habit she was trying to get used to. Suddenly, a faint noise crackled through the monitor. Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. It was subtle at first, like the rustling of fabric, but then it grew clearer, a voice, soft and low, barely audible over the static. "Show, it's okay. I'm here." Emily blinked, convinced that her mind was playing tricks on her. She leaned forward, staring at the monitor, waiting for the sound to repeat, but the silence had returned. Lucy's soft breathing was all that filled the room again. Emily shook her head, chalking it up to interference or a nearby baby monitor on the same frequency. After all, she had heard that could happen sometimes. Still, the feeling lingered. She felt a chill crawl up her spine, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. James returned home later that evening, his face tired but cheerful after a long day at work. Emily shared her strange experience with him, but he shrugged it off. "Probably just some kind of interference, like you said," he reassured her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Nothing to worry about. Emily wanted to believe him. She wanted to shake off the unease and return to the peaceful rhythm of their lives. But as the evening wore on, her mind kept returning to that voice, a voice that had no place in an empty room. That night, after putting Lucy to bed, Emily lay awake, listening to the stillness of the house. The baby monitor sat on her bedside table, its steady hum a reminder that everything was fine. But Emily couldn't help but feel as though something or someone was watching. When sleep finally took her, it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of whispers in the dark and unseen eyes watching from the corners of the room. The next day, Emily woke up determined to brush off her paranoia. She busied herself with chores, errands, and taking care of Lucy. The day passed uneventfully, and for a while, she began to feel like herself again. But that night, just as she was about to settle into bed, the baby monitor crackled to life once more. Emily's heart raced as the same voice returned, clearer this time. "Show, don't be afraid." The whisper was unmistakable. It was calm, almost soothing, but the words sent a jolt of fear through Emily's veins. She bolted upright, her eyes locked on the monitor. The camera showed nothing unusual, just Lucy sleeping peacefully in her crib. There was no one in the room. "James," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Listen." James groggily sat up, listening intently, but by the time he was fully alert, the voice was gone. The only sound coming from the monitor was the soft, rhythmic breathing of their baby. "You're hearing things, Em," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "It's probably just interference again." But Emily knew what she had heard, and she knew it wasn't just interference. There was a voice coming from the baby monitor, and it wasn't hers, James, or Lucy's. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the weight of what she had heard the previous night. The calm, almost caring tone of the voice echoed in her mind, making it impossible to focus on the tasks at hand. She hadn't told James just how unsettling the experience had been. He had already brushed it off once, and she didn't want him to think she was letting her imagination get the best of her. As she carried Lucy downstairs to the living room, Emily noticed something strange. The baby monitor, which was usually plugged into the wall by the crib, had been moved. It was sitting on the edge of Lucy's dresser, as though someone had carefully placed it there. She stood still for a moment, staring at the monitor. Did I move this last night? She asked herself aloud, trying to remember. Maybe she had accidentally bumped it while adjusting Lucy's blankets, but something fell off. The monitor wasn't just moved, it was angled perfectly toward the crib, as if someone had repositioned it to get a better view. Brushing the thought aside, Emily set Lucy down in her playpen and decided to go about her day. But everywhere she turned, something small yet unsettling caught her attention. The faintest details, but enough to make her question her own memory. The first thing she noticed was the baby's blanket. It had always been neatly folded at the foot of Lucy's crib, but now it was draped over the side, as if someone had just used it. Emily could have sworn she hadn't left it like that. In the kitchen, the door to the pantry was ajar, though she was certain she had closed it earlier. The cupboard above the sink creaked open slightly, something it never did unless pulled with force. Emily began to wonder if she was just being paranoid, but the oddities kept building up, one after another. She couldn't ignore them. Later that afternoon, while Lucy napped upstairs, Emily sat on the couch, keeping one eye on the monitor and the other on the clock. She had a sinking feeling in her stomach, as though the house was conspiring against her, whispering secrets that she wasn't meant to hear. She knew the baby monitor would come alive again, and part of her dreaded it. She tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone, but every noise in the house, every creak and groan, drew her attention back to the monitor. Hours passed, and as night fell, the familiar hum of the device was once again the only sound in the room. Emily told herself that it was just a coincidence, that she was letting fear cloud her judgment. But as soon as she put Lucy to bed, her anxiety flared up again. The memory of that soft, disembodied voice gnawed at her thoughts. She sat in bed, watching the baby monitor intently, waiting for something to happen. Lucy slept peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling, a picture of innocence in the dim glow of the nightlight. Then it happened. The monitor crackled once again, and this time the voice was clearer, closer. Lucy, it's okay. I'm watching over you." Emily's heart raced. This wasn't random interference. This wasn't static. Someone or something was speaking to her child. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stared at the monitor, hoping to catch a glimpse of the intruder, but there was no one. Just Lucy, sound asleep, oblivious to the strange voice. Emily bolted out of bed and rushed to the nursery. The door was closed, just as she had left it, but she didn't hesitate to push it open. Inside, everything appeared normal. Lucy was still asleep in her crib, the room undisturbed. Yet the voice had been unmistakable, intimate, as if it were coming from someone right there in the room. Her eyes scanned every corner, every shadow. There was nothing, no one. As she stood there, trying to steady her breathing, the baby monitor in her hand crackled again. "I'm always with you." Emily's grip tightened on the monitor. Her first instinct was to check every inch of the room, but there was no one to be found. She couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was coming from somewhere nearby. But how? The room was empty, the windows locked. There was no way for anyone to be in here without her knowing. Emily's mind raced. Was she losing it? Was this postpartum anxiety playing tricks on her? But no, she had heard it. She wasn't imagining things. The next few days were a blur. Emily became hyper-aware of every detail in the house. She kept Lucy close at all times, refusing to leave her unattended for even a moment. James noticed the shift in her demeanor, but every time he asked, Emily brushed it off, unwilling to admit how unsettled she truly was. That evening, as the baby monitor sat quietly on the table, Emily paced around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. She replayed the voice in her head over and over again, analyzing every word, every inflection. It wasn't threatening, but the fact that it existed at all was enough to terrify her. And then, for the first time, she wondered, what if the voice wasn't trying to harm Lucy? What if it was something else entirely, something trying to protect her? Emily shook the thought away, dismissing it as absurd. But the voice had said, "I'm always with you," and she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a random occurrence. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking through the monitor wasn't done. As Emily stared out the window, lost in thought, she failed to notice the faint figure in the corner of the room, a shadow so subtle it barely caught the light. But it was there, watching, waiting. The unease that had been brewing in Emily's mind now began to seep into her every waking moment. The baby monitor had become an object of terror, not simply a device meant to ensure her daughter's safety. No matter how hard she tried, Emily could no longer view it as a harmless piece of technology. It had become a portal, a conduit for something that she didn't understand, something that was slowly unraveling her grip on reality. Every night since that second incident, Emily found herself fixated on the monitor, watching and waiting for the voice to return. During the day, she tried to go through the motions of normalcy, but her nerves were constantly on edge. She began to question every sound, every flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. Something was off, deeply wrong, and the more she tried to push those thoughts away, the stronger they became. One afternoon, as Emily sat with Lucy in the living room, her phone rang. It was her best friend, Sophie. Emily hadn't spoken to her in days, and she could hear the concern in Sophie's voice immediately. "Hey, Emily, you haven't been answering my texts. Is everything okay?" Emily hesitated for a moment. Could she really tell Sophie what was going on? Would she even believe her? After a beat, Emily decided to open up, even if it meant sounding a little crazy. "There's something weird happening, Soph," Emily began, glancing nervously at Lucy as if the baby might somehow hear her. "It's the baby monitor. I've been hearing a voice. Someone's talking through it." Sophie was silent for a moment, then laughed nervously. "Are you serious? Maybe it's picking up interference from another house? That happens sometimes, right?" Emily shook her head, even though Sophie couldn't see her. "No, this is different. It's not just random noise. The voice, it talks to Lucy like it knows her, like it's in the room with her." Sophie's laughter faded, replaced by genuine concern. Emily, that's creepy. Have you told James? He doesn't believe me. He thinks I'm just tired or stressed, but it's real, sophomore. I swear it." Sophie paused again, her voice softer this time. "Look, maybe you're just overtired. New mom stuff, right? Lack of sleep can do weird things to your brain." Emily didn't respond. Sophie's words, though well-intentioned, weren't comforting. It wasn't just in her head. She knew that much. As they hung up, Emily's phone chimed with a notification. It was the baby monitor app, an alert indicating noise in Lucy's room. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Lucy was supposed to be napping. Without thinking, she raced up the stairs, phone in hand, her pulse quickening with every step. She burst into Lucy's room, half expecting to find someone standing over the crib. But the room was empty. Lucy was fast asleep, her small hand curled around her favorite stuffed rabbit. Emily checked the app again. The noise alert had been triggered just moments ago, but there was nothing to explain it. As she stood in the dimly lit room, the familiar sound of the baby monitor crackling filled the silence. "Emily," her breath caught in her throat. The voice had said her name this time. Not Lucy's. Hers. The chill that ran down Emily's spine was unlike anything she had ever felt. The voice had changed too. It wasn't the gentle, soothing tone she had heard before. This was colder, more deliberate, as if it was trying to get her attention directly. Panic welled up inside her, and for the first time, she considered the possibility that this wasn't just some strange interference. This was something much worse. She grabbed Lucy from her crib, clutching her tightly against her chest, and ran back to her bedroom. As she locked the door behind her, her mind raced. What could she do? Who could help her? If she told James again, he'd just dismiss it like before. She needed to figure out what was happening before it got worse, before whatever was speaking through that monitor crossed over from sound to something more tangible, more dangerous. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to move with intent. She kept the baby monitor on her nightstand, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. She was terrified of hearing the voice again, but even more terrified of what it might say next. The voice had said her name. What did that mean? Was it watching her too? The thought sent a shiver through her, and she pulled the blankets tighter around herself, as though they could protect her from whatever unseen force was creeping into her life. Days turned into a restless blur. Emily began avoiding the baby monitor as much as possible. During the day, she tried to distract herself by focusing on Lucy's care, but her mind always wandered back to the voice. At night, she kept the monitor turned on but muted, afraid to hear anything but too scared to turn it off completely. One afternoon, Emily made a decision. She needed answers. There had to be some explanation, even if it wasn't a rational one. She found herself searching online for anything that could help her understand what was happening. Paranormal forums, ghost stories, articles about haunted technology. Nothing seemed to offer a solution that made sense. But the more she read, the more she started to believe that this wasn't just some modern-day glitch. Emily began noticing other things as well. The strange anomalies in the house, once small and almost ignorable, started to escalate. Objects would be moved from their usual places without explanation. Lights would flicker, sometimes turning off completely in rooms that Emily had just left. The temperature in Lucy's room seemed to drop at odd times, so much so that Emily had to add extra blankets to keep her baby warm. And then there were the footsteps. They started late one night, just after Emily had put Lucy to bed. She was sitting in the living room, trying to relax with a cup of tea, when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the rhythmic thud of each step was too deliberate, too precise. Someone or something was walking down the hallway. She froze, gripping the edge of the couch, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped directly outside the nursery door. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She stood, moving as quietly as possible, and crept up the stairs. When she reached the top, the hallway was empty. The door to Lucy's room was slightly ajar, just enough for her to peer inside. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, her breath shallow and quick, heart pounding like a drum in her ears. The door to Lucy's room was slightly open, and the faint light from the night lamp spilled out into the dark hallway. Her mind raced. What had just happened? Were those really footsteps she heard? Or was it her exhausted mind playing tricks on her again? But the sound had been so real, so distinct. Someone had been walking in the hallway outside her daughter's room. She was sure of it. Her hand shook as she slowly pushed open the door to Lucy's nursery. The soft hum of the baby monitor greeted her, casting a strange sense of normalcy in the room. Yet everything felt wrong. Lucy slept peacefully in her crib, her small body rising and falling with each breath. Emily took a hesitant step inside, her eyes scanning every corner of the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain what she had just heard. Nothing. The air was thick with an oppressive silence. Emily walked toward the crib, her legs unsteady beneath her, and knelt beside it, brushing Lucy's soft hair away from her face. She looked down at her daughter, feeling an overwhelming sense of protectiveness surge through her. Whatever was happening in this house, she would not let it harm Lucy. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she could not sleep. She kept replaying the sound of those footsteps over and over again in her mind, trying to find some logical explanation. Could it have been the wind? No, that didn't make sense. The steps had been too deliberate, too human. Her thoughts spiraled as she stared up at the ceiling, listening intently to the silence around her. Hours passed, and just as Emily felt herself starting to drift off, the baby monitor crackled to life again. Emily, her eyes snapped open, heart hammering in her chest. The voice had returned. She stared at the monitor, its small screen glowing eerily in the dark. The voice wasn't coming from Lucy's room this time. It was addressing her directly. Emily. The voice was more insistent now, no longer soft or gentle. There was something dark and commanding in its tone, and it sent an icy chill through her veins. For a long moment, she couldn't move, paralyzed by the fear coursing through her body. Come to me? Those words froze her completely. She wanted to scream, to run, to throw the monitor out the window, and pretend this was all just a nightmare, but she couldn't. She felt trapped, as though the voice had somehow taken hold of her mind and body, refusing to let her go. Emily grabbed the monitor with shaking hands and turned it off. Silence engulfed the room once more, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. She sat up in bed, her breaths coming in shallow gasps as she tried to regain control of her thoughts. The walls of the house felt as though they were closing in around her, suffocating her with their oppressive stillness. Hours passed, and Emily didn't dare close her eyes. She stayed awake, sitting upright in bed, waiting for the dawn. But as the night wore on, she began to feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. Her body craved sleep, but her mind was on high alert, refusing to let her rest. Suddenly, a noise pierced the silence. A faint creak from the hallway outside her bedroom. The same sound she had heard before, the sound of footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop outside Lucy's door. They were moving closer. Emily's heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, more distinct, and she realized with growing dread that they were coming toward her room. She stood up quickly, her pulse thundering in her ears as she backed away from the door. For a moment, she considered locking herself in the bathroom or running downstairs, but her legs felt like lead. Her gaze darted toward the baby monitor on the nightstand, the screen still dark from when she had turned it off earlier. She picked it up and turned it back on, needing to see what was happening in Lucy's room. The monitor flickered to life, and Emily's blood ran cold. There, in the corner of the screen, was a figure. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but it was unmistakable. Someone was standing in Lucy's room. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the monitor, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The figure didn't move, but it was there, watching over her daughter. She couldn't make out any features, but the darkness seemed to cling to the figure as if it were made of shadow itself. Her mind raced with panic. What could she do? Call the police? Run in there and confront it? But how could she protect Lucy from something that wasn't even human? The figure didn't seem solid. It was more like a presence, something malevolent and otherworldly. As she stood there, frozen in fear, the figure on the screen slowly began to move. It stepped closer to Lucy's crib, and Emily's panic reached a fever pitch. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch. Without thinking, Emily bolted toward Lucy's room, her bare feet pounding against the wooden floor. She flung the door open, her heart racing, and rushed to the crib. But the room was empty. Lucy was sleeping soundly, just as she had been before. There was no figure, no shadowy presence. Emily's eyes darted around the room, searching every corner, but there was nothing. The air was still, and the only sound was the soft hum of the baby monitor. But Emily knew what she had seen. That figure had been real, and it had been standing over her daughter's crib, watching her. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized how close she had come to losing Lucy, how close this thing had come to her child. She couldn't stay in this house any longer. Whatever was happening, it was escalating, and she knew it would only get worse if she didn't do something. But what could she do? Where could she go? As Emily stood there, clutching Lucy protectively in her arms, she knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. Emily sat in the living room, cradling Lucy in her arms, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. The morning light filtered through the curtains, offering no sense of relief after the terror of the night. The figure, the voice, the footsteps, none of it made any sense, and yet it was real. She could still feel the icy presence that had been in Lucy's room, the cold dread that had taken root in her heart. She knew she had to leave, but something held her back. This house had been her home, a place of safety and warmth, but now it felt like a prison. There was something deeper going on, something tied to the house itself. Emily had to find out what was haunting her family before it consumed them entirely. Her first thought was to call the police, but what would she tell them? That a shadowy figure had appeared in her baby's room, or that a disembodied voice had spoken to her through the baby monitor. No, they'd think she was crazy, and even if they believed her, what could they possibly do about it? Emily needed answers, and the only way to get them was to dig into the house's past. She had never been curious about the previous owners before, but now it felt like the only logical step. Maybe something had happened here, something that explained the dark presence that seemed to be growing stronger every day. She began her search online, looking up the property records for the house. It didn't take long for her to find what she was looking for. The house had been built in the 1940s and had passed through several owners over the decades. But one name stood out among the others: Margaret Holloway. The records indicated that Margaret had lived in the house for over 40 years before it was sold to the family, who had owned it just before Emily and her husband had moved in. Something about the name tugged at Emily's memory, but she couldn't place it. She continued digging, looking for any mention of Margaret in local news archives or community records. It took hours of searching, but eventually, Emily found what she was looking for: a small, faded newspaper article from the early 1980s. The headline read, "Local Tragedy. Margaret Holloway's infant daughter found dead in home." Emily's heart sank as she read the article. Margaret's daughter, Grace, had been just a few months old when she died mysteriously in her crib. The cause of death had been listed as sudden infant death syndrome, but there had been whispers in the community about strange occurrences in the house, even before the tragedy. Neighbors had reported hearing strange noises coming from the home, and some claimed to have seen Margaret wandering the streets late at night, talking to someone who wasn't there. Emily's pulse quickened. Was that what was happening now? Was Margaret's grief or her obsession with her daughter's death somehow tied to the presence in the house? Had Margaret herself been haunted by the same figure Emily had seen watching over Lucy? As Emily stared at the article, a creeping sense of dread filled her. It couldn't be a coincidence that she was now experiencing the same things that had plagued Margaret Holloway. The voice on the monitor, the figure in the nursery, it was all connected. But how? Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She needed to know what had happened to Margaret after her daughter's death. Why had she stayed in the house for so long? And most importantly, why had the haunting seemingly stopped after Margaret left? She searched for more information about Margaret, eventually finding a second article from the mid-1990s. Margaret had been committed to a psychiatric hospital after a breakdown. According to the article, she had claimed that her daughter's spirit was still in the house, that Grace had never left her, and that someone or something was trying to take her baby away. The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood up. The more she read, the more it became clear that Margaret had believed there was something evil in the house, something that wanted her child. And now it wanted Lucy. Emily's heart pounded as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Margaret had lost her mind trying to protect her daughter, and now Emily feared the same thing was happening to her. She had to get Lucy out of the house before it was too late. But even as she considered leaving, a thought gnawed at the back of her mind. If they left, would they be safe? Or would whatever was haunting them follow? Emily shook her head, trying to focus. She had to take this one step at a time. First, she needed to find someone who could help her understand what was happening. The idea of contacting a psychic or paranormal investigator crossed her mind, but she wasn't sure if she believed in that kind of thing. Still, after everything she had seen, it was hard to deny that something supernatural was at work. She decided to reach out to an old friend, Madison, who had always been interested in the paranormal. Madison had once dabbled in ghost hunting, and though Emily had never taken her seriously before, she was desperate for answers now. Emily called Madison, explaining everything that had been happening in the house. She told her about the voice on the monitor, the figure in Lucy's room, and the disturbing history of the previous owner, Margaret Holloway. Madison listened intently, her voice calm and serious. "It sounds like you've got a classic haunting on your hands," she said. "But this isn't just any ghost. From what you're describing, it sounds like it's something darker. Maybe a spirit that's attached to the house, or even to you." The thought sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are a few things we can try," Madison said. "But first, I need to come over and see the house for myself. I'll bring some equipment and do a little investigating. We'll figure this out together." Emily agreed, though a part of her was terrified of what they might uncover. She didn't know if she could handle any more shocks, but she also knew she couldn't go on living in fear like this. That evening, Madison arrived at the house with a backpack full of gear: EMF detectors, digital recorders, and even a thermal camera. She wasted no time setting everything up, her face a mask of concentration as she moved from room to room. Emily stayed close to Madison, clutching Lucy tightly, her nerves on edge. Every creak of the house, every flicker of light made her jump. Madison spent hours investigating, asking questions aloud, trying to provoke a response from whatever entity was in the house. For most of the evening, nothing happened. The equipment stayed quiet, the house eerily still. But just as they were about to call it a night, something changed. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and the EMF detector in Madison's hand lit up like a Christmas tree. Madison's eyes widened as she stared at the device. "Something's here," she whispered. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she felt a sudden, overwhelming presence in the room. It was the same feeling she had felt the night before in Lucy's nursery, an oppressive weight, like being watched by something unseen. And then from the baby monitor on the coffee table, they both heard it. "Emily." The voice was back, but this time Madison heard it too. Her face went pale as she turned toward the monitor, the color draining from her cheeks. "Oh my God," Madison whispered. "It's real." The voice came again, louder now, more insistent. "Come to me." Emily stared at the monitor in horror. She had thought she could handle whatever was haunting the house. But now, faced with undeniable proof that something sinister was targeting her and her daughter, she wasn't so sure. "Leave this house," the voice demanded, its tone cold and commanding. Madison grabbed Emily's arm. "We need to go. Now." But Emily hesitated. She couldn't just leave without knowing the truth. What was this thing? Why was it here? And most importantly, how could she protect Lucy? She knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. As the haunting voice echoed through the house, commanding them to leave, Emily felt torn between the instinct to flee and the need for answers. Her maternal instinct screamed for her to protect Lucy, but the mystery of the house and the dark presence that had taken root in her life was something she couldn't turn her back on. Madison, still gripping her arm, pulled her toward the front door. "Emily, I'm serious. This isn't something you can just figure out. We need to leave." But Emily stood frozen, staring at the baby monitor that had become a conduit for whatever malevolent entity was tormenting them. The voice had stopped, but the eerie silence in its wake was almost worse. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. "I can't," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "I need to know what's going on." Madison's expression shifted from fear to concern. "You're not thinking straight. Look at what's happening. This thing is not going to stop. It's dangerous. What if it hurts Lucy?" At the mention of her daughter, Emily's heart clenched. She knew Madison was right, but something deep inside her refused to let go. If they ran now, the terror might follow them, and they would never know how to stop it. Whatever had haunted Margaret Holloway decades ago was now coming after them, and the answers might be hidden within these walls. "Just give me one more day," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "If we don't find anything, we'll leave. I swear." Madison shook her head, but her resistance faltered. One day, she relented, her voice tight with anxiety. "But if things get worse, we're out of here. No more debates." Emily nodded in agreement, though the dread continued to coil inside her like a living thing. She hoped she could unravel this mystery before it was too late. That night, Madison stayed with Emily, both of them too scared to sleep. They kept all the lights on, and Madison set up her equipment in the hallway outside Lucy's room, hoping to catch any further disturbances. Emily watched her daughter sleep through the baby monitor, terrified that the figure would return. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. Every sound, every shadow seemed menacing, like the house was waiting for the right moment to strike. Madison kept glancing at the EMF detector and the thermal camera, but nothing unusual registered. Just after 2 a.m., Lucy began to stir. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she watched the monitor, praying her daughter would stay asleep. But then Lucy's eyes fluttered open, and she began to cry softly. Emily rushed to the nursery, her nerves on edge. The room was cold, unnaturally so, and her breath fogged in the air as she stepped inside. She hurried to Lucy's crib, and lifted her, holding her close in an attempt to comfort both of them. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here," Emily whispered, though her voice trembled with fear. As she cradled Lucy, something on the floor caught her eye, a faint, almost imperceptible trail of footprints leading from the corner of the room to the crib. Emily's stomach twisted in horror. The prints were small, too small for an adult, but far too large to belong to Lucy. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen these footprints before, on the night she had heard the voice for the first time. They were the same eerie, childlike prints that had appeared outside her bedroom door. She backed away from the crib, clutching Lucy to her chest as she stared at the footprints. They seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as if they were made of something otherworldly. Panic surged through her, and she called for Madison. Madison rushed into the room, her face pale. "What is it?" Emily pointed to the footprints. "They're back. Look." Madison knelt down, examining the prints carefully. "These weren't here before," she said, her voice shaky. "I checked the room earlier. There's no way." But Emily knew. The figure, the childlike presence, it was still here, still haunting them. And it was getting bolder. Madison stood up, her face grim. "Emily, this is escalating. We can't wait any longer. We need to get out of this house." Emily nodded, her mind racing. But even as the terror gripped her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of discovering something important. What did these footprints mean? Who or what was trying to reach Lucy? Reluctantly, Emily agreed to leave, but she needed to gather some things before they went. She handed Lucy to Madison, her heart pounding as she hurried down the hallway toward her bedroom. She grabbed a small suitcase from the closet and began packing hastily, her mind swirling with fear and confusion. As she stuffed clothes into the suitcase, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a text message from an unknown number. Her hands trembled as she opened the message. The text was short, but it sent a chill through her entire body. "It's not Lucy I want." Emily's breath hitched, her vision blurring as she stared at the message in disbelief. Her hands began to shake violently, and the phone slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she knew the truth. The haunting, the voice, the footsteps, it wasn't after Lucy. It was after her. In that moment, Emily's world seemed to collapse in on itself. She had spent the past weeks believing that the presence in the house was targeting her daughter, but now everything was different. The terror wasn't centered around Lucy, it was around her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stood frozen in the middle of the room, her thoughts spiraling out of control. Why her? Why now? And what did this thing want? Before she could even begin to process the message, a loud crash echoed from Lucy's nursery. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she spun around and bolted down the hallway. When she reached the nursery, she found Madison standing in the middle of the room, her face drained of all color. "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Look." Emily followed Madison's gaze, and her blood ran cold. The crib, once in its place against the wall, was now pushed to the center of the room. The mobile above it was spinning furiously, as if an unseen force was toying with it. And on the wall, written in what appeared to be smeared ash, were two chilling words. "Come home." Emily's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. Whatever was haunting them wasn't just playing games anymore. It was making demands. It wanted something, no, someone. And Emily feared she knew exactly who it was waiting for. Emily's breath caught in her throat, the walls of the nursery seeming to close in around her. The message smeared across the wall in dark. Ashen letters seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, as if it had been written just moments ago by some unseen hand. Madison clutched Lucy tightly, her eyes wide with terror as she backed away from the crib. "Emily, we have to go. Now." But Emily couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor as her mind raced. "Come home." The words rang in her ears, reverberating through her like a bell tolling a final, grim warning. Her thoughts spiraled into confusion and dread. What did come home mean? Where was this home that the entity referred to? And why was it focused on her? The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the air around them thick with a cold, oppressive force. Emily could feel it pressing in on her, suffocating her with an invisible weight. She wanted to run, to flee this cursed house and never look back, but something inside her fought against it. The house wasn't just haunted, it was demanding something of her, and she feared that no matter how far they ran, the entity wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Madison shook her, snapping her out of her daze. "Emily, we need to leave." Her voice was a frantic whisper, laced with urgency. "This thing, it's not going to stop until we're gone. Look at what's happening." Emily tore her gaze away from the wall and nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to protect Lucy. That was all that mattered now. Without another word, she grabbed the baby bag from the dresser and hurried out of the nursery. Madison followed close behind, clutching Lucy to her chest as they rushed down the stairs. Every shadow, every creak of the old house felt alive with malice, as if the entity was watching their every move, waiting for them to make a mistake. As they reached the front door, Emily fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The air around them seemed to grow thicker, heavier, and she could feel the pressure of something unseen closing in on them. Finally, the lock clicked and Emily yanked the door open. Cold night air rushed in, a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere inside the house. They stumbled out onto the porch, and for a brief moment, Emily felt the weight lift from her shoulders. But as they stepped onto the driveway, a loud crash echoed from inside the house, followed by a deafening silence. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she spun around, staring at the darkened windows of the house. It was as if the house itself had come alive, angry at their attempt to escape. "We need to get out of here," Madison whispered, her voice barely audible as she hurried toward the car, Lucy still cradled in her arms. Emily followed, but as she reached for the car door, something stopped her. A feeling, no, a pull, deep inside her chest, tugging her back toward the house. She froze, her hand hovering over the door handle as her mind raced. It wasn't Lucy the entity wanted. It wasn't even the house itself. It was her. The realization hit her like a freight train. The voice on the baby monitor, the footprints, the cryptic messages, it had all been leading to this moment. The entity had lured her into this house for a reason, and now it was demanding that she stay. Madison's voice broke through her thoughts. "Emily, what are you doing? Get in the car." But Emily couldn't move. Something stronger than fear was keeping her rooted in place. Her gaze locked on the front door of the house. It was calling to her, pulling her back into the darkness, into whatever nightmare had been waiting for her. "I can't," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't leave." Madison stared at her in disbelief. "What are you talking about? We have to go." But Emily shook her head, her eyes glassy as she turned to face the house once more. "It won't stop," she murmured, almost to herself. "No matter where we go, it'll follow us. I have to face it." Madison's face twisted with fear and frustration. "Emily, please, don't do this. Don't let it win." But Emily knew deep down that this was no longer about winning or losing. The entity had already sunk its claws into her, and running would only delay the inevitable. Whatever truth lay behind the locked room in her house, whatever horror was tied to the message on the wall, it was something she couldn't outrun. "I have to go back," Emily said, her voice steadier now, though her heart pounded in her chest. "I need to end this." Madison's eyes filled with tears as she stepped toward Emily, desperation in her voice. "Please don't do this. Think of Lucy. Think of what this thing could do to you." Emily looked down at her daughter, who was still sleeping peacefully in Madison's arms, blissfully unaware of the terror surrounding them. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she reached out and gently stroked Lucy's cheek. "I am thinking of her," she whispered. "That's why I have to do this." Madison shook her head, but before she could protest further, Emily turned and walked back toward the house. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking through thick, suffocating air. The house loomed before her, its dark windows like empty, soulless eyes staring down at her. As she reached the front door, the temperature dropped even further, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into her very core. She placed her hand on the door handle, hesitating for just a moment before pushing it open. The house seemed to groan in response, the air inside thick with an oppressive silence. Emily stepped over the threshold, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as she made her way down the hallway. The footprints, the message on the wall, the voice. It all led to the locked room at the end of the hall, the one place in the house she had never dared to enter. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she wrapped her fingers around the cold metal knob. For a moment, she considered turning back, running to the safety of Madison and Lucy, but something stopped her. This was her fight. Whatever horror awaited her behind this door, she had to face it. For Lucy, for herself. Taking a deep breath, Emily turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint moonlight filtering through a small, cracked window. Dust swirled in the air, and the scent of decay clung to every surface. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped inside. But it was the figure standing in the corner that froze her blood. A child, no older than 6, stood with its back to her, its pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and long, dark hair hung limply around its face. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly turned to face her, revealing hollow, black eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque, toothy grin. It spoke, its voice a soft, chilling whisper. "Come home, Emily?" Emily's heart stopped at the sight of the childlike figure standing before her. The words hung in the air, resonating with a deep, dark familiarity that sent shivers down her spine. The room felt impossibly small now, the air heavy with an oppressive, otherworldly presence. "Come home, Emily?" The voice, cold, mechanical, and devoid of emotion, did not belong to the child. It echoed from somewhere deeper, darker. Emily's mind screamed at her to turn around, to flee, to run back to Madison and Lucy, but her legs wouldn't move. The pull she had felt before, that strange force drawing her to this room, seemed stronger than ever now, rooting her in place. The figure, though childlike in appearance, was clearly not human. Its grin stretched wider, splitting its face unnaturally as it took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The movement sent a wave of nausea through Emily, her body instinctively recoiling from the thing that approached. Emily's mind raced, struggling to understand. Why was it calling her home? This wasn't her home, but the words echoed relentlessly in her head, gnawing at the edges of her sanity, stirring memories she couldn't place, emotions she didn't understand. There was something about that voice, something unsettlingly familiar, as though it had been a part of her life all along, hidden in the shadows, waiting for this moment. She took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the creature drew closer, its lifeless eyes locked on hers. The smell of decay grew stronger, an acrid stench that burned her throat and filled her lungs. She tried to summon the strength to run, to scream, but it was as though the house itself had swallowed her voice. The figure stopped just a few feet in front of her, tilting its head again, that grotesque smile widening even further. "You can't leave," it whispered, the words sending an icy chill down her spine. "Not until you remember." Remember? Emily's voice was barely a whisper, her mind whirling with confusion and terror. "What are you talking about?" The figure's hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul as it leaned closer, its face mere inches from hers now. "This house is yours. You've always been here." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and suddenly, flashes of images, fragments of memories long buried, began to flood her mind. She saw herself as a child, running through the halls of this very house, her laughter echoing off the walls. She saw her parents, their faces obscured by a fog of time, but their voices familiar. They called her name, Emily, over and over again. But these memories didn't make sense. This wasn't her childhood home. She had never lived here, had she? And yet, the images continued to play out in her mind, vivid and real, as if they had been there all along, waiting to be unlocked. "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head, trying to clear the fog of confusion. "This isn't my home. I don't remember this. I don't." The figure's grin faltered, and its eyes darkened, the room growing colder still. "You must remember," it said, its voice now sharp, insistent. "Remember, or you'll never leave." Emily backed up until she felt the cold wood of the doorframe against her back, her heart racing. The memories were coming faster now, more disjointed. She saw herself standing in this very room, but much younger. She was holding something, no someone, a baby. Her baby. Her breath caught as the realization hit her. She had been here before. She had lived in this house. But why couldn't she remember? Why had these memories been locked away? She looked at the figure again, her hands trembling. "What do you want from me?" The childlike figure stood motionless, its grin fading into a more somber expression. "The truth," it whispered. "It's time for you to face the truth." Emily's heart pounded as she took another step back, her mind racing. The truth. What truth? What had happened here that she couldn't remember? The room began to spin as the weight of the past collided with the present. The memories were fragments, shards of a forgotten life that now cut deep, filling her with a fear unlike any she had ever known. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut, sealing her inside. The sharp sound jolted her out of her thoughts, her panic rising as she tugged on the doorknob, desperate to escape. But it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. The figure's voice grew louder, echoing through the room. "You left us. You abandoned us. Emily. Now, you must pay the price." Emily shook her head frantically, her hands still gripping the door. "No, I didn't abandon anyone," she cried, her voice cracking with desperation. But the figure remained unmoved, its expression cold and unfeeling. "You forgot," it said, taking another step closer. "And now, we will make sure you never forget again." Tears streamed down Emily's face as the memories continued to flood her mind, overwhelming her. She saw the nursery, her baby, the sound of a lullaby playing softly in the background. And then darkness, a void where everything had been ripped away. She couldn't remember what had happened next. It was as if a part of her life had been erased, leaving only an empty shell of who she once was. But now, standing in this cursed room, the pieces were slowly coming together. The truth was there, just beyond her reach, buried beneath years of denial and fear. Whatever had happened in this house, it was the key to everything, to her past, to the entity that now haunted her, and to her freedom. The figure stretched out its hand, its cold fingers inches from Emily's face. "Come home, Emily," it whispered again, the words dripping with a terrible finality. Emily's eyes widened, her body shaking as she felt the darkness closing in around her. This was it, the moment of reckoning. She could either confront the truth, no matter how horrifying, or be consumed by it forever. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she met the figure's hollow gaze and whispered, "Show me." For a brief, terrifying moment, nothing happened. The room was still, silent, and Emily feared that it was already too late. But then, the figure smiled again, a chilling, knowing smile, and the world around her shattered. Darkness engulfed her, pulling her into the depths of her forgotten memories. Emily's world dissolved into a vortex of shadows and distant echoes. She was no longer in the room. Instead, she was drifting through a vast, unsettling darkness. Her surroundings were indiscernible, shifting like a fog in her mind. The weight of forgotten memories pressed down on her, swirling in fragmented images and broken whispers. Suddenly, she found herself standing in the middle of a room, a nursery. Her heart sank as she recognized the details. This was the room she had just left, but now it was pristine. The crib in the corner was new, with soft linens folded neatly inside. A mobile hung from the ceiling, slowly turning, casting faint shadows on the walls. The air smelled of baby powder and fresh paint, and the sunlight streamed through the window, painting the space in a warm, golden hue. But despite the serene scene, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Not again. Her gaze traveled to the crib, and her breath caught in her throat. A baby lay sleeping peacefully inside. Emily's heart leapt in her chest. She took a step closer, her legs trembling beneath her. As she approached, the baby stirred. Tiny fingers clenched and unclenched, and then the child's eyes fluttered open, bright, innocent, and impossibly familiar. Emily's breath hitched. She knew this baby. The rush of recognition flooded her mind, but with it came confusion and fear. The baby cooed softly, and for a moment, Emily felt an overwhelming maternal instinct. She reached out, her hand hovering above the crib, wanting to touch, to hold the child. But then the memories started to return, flashes of that fateful night. The night everything had changed. The night she had lost everything. The room around her flickered, the warm sunlight dimming, and a cold breeze swept through the nursery, rattling the mobile overhead. Emily's hand froze in midair. She remembered now, the cries, the terror, the shadows that had slithered into the room that night. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. The baby looked up at her, but its face began to blur, twisting into something unnatural. The once soft cooing turned into a distorted cry, low and guttural. Emily stumbled, her back hitting the wall as the room grew colder, the air thick with an invisible menace. Suddenly, the door to the nursery creaked open on its own, revealing a figure standing in the doorway. Emily's breath caught as she recognized the silhouette. It was her, but not the woman she was now. It was a younger version of herself, dressed in the nightgown she hadn't seen in years. The younger Emily stared at her, her expression blank, but her eyes were hollow, lifeless. "You left us," the younger version whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing cry of the child. "You abandoned us, Emily. You promised, but you left us." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." But the figure took a step closer, her eyes narrowing, dark circles forming beneath them. "You forgot," she hissed. "You ran away from the truth, and now you'll never escape." The room around them began to collapse, the walls cracking and splintering. The crib rattled violently as the baby's cries grew louder, morphing into something monstrous. Emily's heart raced as she scrambled to the door, desperate to get out, but the figure blocked her path, its face distorting into a grotesque, twisted version of her own. "Face it, Emily!" the figure screamed, its voice echoing through the crumbling nursery. "Face the truth." Emily's vision blurred, her chest tightening as panic gripped her. The weight of the forgotten memories pressed down on her, suffocating her. She was trapped in the past, in this house, in this nightmare. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The room, the cries, the figure, it all vanished, leaving Emily standing alone in a void of darkness. She gasped for air, her hands trembling. She had no idea how long she had been standing there, but it felt like an eternity. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what she had seen, what she had felt. The weight of the past was crushing her, threatening to consume her entirely. But then, a faint light appeared in the distance. Emily blinked, her eyes straining to see through the inky blackness. The light grew brighter, flickering like a candle flame, beckoning her forward. She took a hesitant step, and then another, drawn toward the glow. As she moved closer, the light revealed a figure. This time, not the distorted version of herself, but someone else. A woman, tall and thin, with long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp and piercing, and she wore a long, flowing dress that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Emily stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't recognize this woman, but there was something about her, something familiar and terrifying all at once. The woman smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent chills down Emily's spine. "You've come far," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "But the journey isn't over yet." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Who are you?" she whispered. The woman's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling light. "I'm the one who holds the truth, Emily. The truth you've been running from for so long." Emily shook her head, confusion washing over her. I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling. What truth? Why can't I remember? The woman took a step forward, her movements graceful and fluid. Because you chose to forget, she said softly. You locked it away deep inside where you thought it could never reach you. But you were wrong. The past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you run. Emily's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The weight of her forgotten memories pressed down on her once again, suffocating her. The woman reached out, her fingers brushing against Emily's cheek. But now it's time, she whispered. Time to remember. Before Emily could react, the woman placed her hand on Emily's forehead, and a surge of energy shot through her. The darkness around them shattered, and in its place, a flood of memories rushed into Emily's mind. Memories of the house, the nursery, the baby, and something else. Something darker. Something she had buried deep within herself. Something too painful to face. Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, clutching her head as the memories overwhelmed her. She saw herself standing in the nursery, holding the baby, tears streaming down her face as the walls closed in around her. She saw shadows creeping along the walls, heard whispers in the dark, felt the weight of an unspeakable loss. And then she remembered. The memories crashed over Emily like a tidal wave, drowning her in the haunting echoes of a night she had fought so hard to forget. She was back in that nursery, the smell of baby powder thick in the air, her arms cradling the tiny, fragile body of her infant. The weight in her arms was both familiar and agonizingly heavy, the warmth of the baby's skin pressed against hers. Tears blurred her vision as the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, creeping closer. But there was something more, something lurking in the background of her memory, an overwhelming sense of dread that had twisted its way into her life that night. The shadows weren't just figments of her imagination. They were real, and they were watching. Emily's breathing quickened as she clutched her head, the memories coming in fragmented, chaotic bursts. She remembered the nursery window rattling in the night, the soft cooing of the baby turning into shrill cries as the temperature in the room dropped. She had tried to calm the baby, to rock her gently in the crook of her arm, but the shadows kept growing, swirling, and whispering around her. The baby's cries grew louder, filling the room, but she was powerless to soothe her. In that moment, she had felt it, something unseen, yet unmistakably present. It was there in the corner of the room, watching with eyes she couldn't see. A cold, malevolent force that had slipped into her life unnoticed and uninvited. The walls of the nursery seemed to close in on her, the air growing heavy and oppressive. Her skin prickled with fear as she looked down at the baby, only to see that her daughter's eyes had gone wide, staring past Emily toward the dark corner. The child had stopped crying, her tiny body stiffening in Emily's arms. For a moment, everything went deathly silent, and then came the voice, low, raspy, and filled with an unnatural hunger. She was never yours to keep. Emily had frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice had slithered through the room, wrapping itself around her like icy tendrils, making it hard to breathe. She had turned slowly, her eyes widening as they focused on the darkened corner of the nursery where the shadows seemed to be pulling themselves together, coalescing into a shape. A figure. It had been tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the crib. Its face had been obscured by darkness, but Emily had known instinctively that it was watching her, watching the baby. The room had felt colder than ever, as if the warmth of life itself was being sucked out, leaving behind only a hollow, oppressive chill. She had backed away, clutching her daughter to her chest, her instincts screaming at her to run. But her feet had felt rooted to the floor, paralyzed by the sheer malevolence that radiated from the figure. It had moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the fear that oozed from every pore of her body. "She's mine," the voice had hissed again, the sound slicing through the air like a knife. "You cannot protect her." Emily had tried to scream, but no sound had come out. Her heart had been hammering in her chest, her skin crawling with terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure had lunged forward, its elongated fingers reaching out, grasping for the child. Emily had spun around, her body acting on pure instinct, and fled the nursery. She had raced down the hall, clutching her baby tightly to her chest, her feet pounding against the wooden floors. She had barely made it to the staircase when the door behind her had slammed shut with an earth-shaking force, the sound reverberating through the house. She had stumbled down the stairs, nearly tripping in her desperation to get away. She had reached the front door, yanking it open with trembling hands, and burst into the cold night air. The wind had howled around her, but she hadn't stopped. She had run, barefoot and frantic, until she had reached the neighbor's house. It was only there, bathed in the porch light of a safe, familiar place, that she had dared to look down at her daughter again. But when she had, the crib was empty. The weight of the memory crushed her, pulling her back to the present with a force so powerful it left her gasping for breath. Emily knelt on the cold floor, her body trembling as tears streaked down her cheeks. She hadn't just lost her daughter that night. Something had taken her, something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. And it had all started with that voice, that terrifying whisper on the baby monitor so many years ago. She had locked it away, buried it deep within herself. But now it was all coming back. The empty crib, the voice, the figure. It was all part of the same terrible truth she had refused to face. Emily struggled to her feet, her legs weak beneath her. The room was still and silent once again, but the darkness felt thicker now, heavier, as if it was waiting, watching. She glanced toward the baby monitor, its screen flickering faintly on the bedside table. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hesitated for just a moment, knowing what she had to do. Slowly, she crossed the room, her breath shallow as she reached for the baby monitor. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the static buzzed to life once more. Emily's heart lurched in her chest as she stared at the screen, her hands trembling. There, in the static-filled darkness, was the crib, empty. But as she watched, her breath caught in her throat. Footprints, small, delicate footprints, appeared one by one, slowly trailing from the crib across the room. They stopped at the edge of the monitor, as though whatever had made them was standing just on the other side, watching her. And then, from the speaker, came the voice, low, raspy, and filled with the same chilling malice that had haunted her all those years ago. "She's still mine, Emily?" Emily screamed. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Let's begin the next story. It had started like any other evening. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a breathtaking view that Sarah took a moment to admire from her window. As she settled into her cozy apartment, she felt the warmth of her blanket wrapping around her like a comforting hug. She had just finished a long day at work, and the soft glow of her bedside lamp created a serene atmosphere, a stark contrast to the bustling city outside. Her favorite novel lay open beside her, but as she read, her mind drifted, distracted by the fatigue that settled over her like a heavy cloak. The rhythmic sound of rain began to patter against the window, creating a soothing backdrop that felt almost hypnotic, lulling her deeper into relaxation. She loved nights like this, quiet, cozy, with the comforting sound of raindrops dancing on glass. But as night fell, an inexplicable chill crept into the room, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She shrugged it off, attributing it to the drafty old windows that never quite sealed shut, a common annoyance in her aging apartment. As she made her way to bed, the soft rustling of the sheets felt comforting. The rain continued to fall, creating a rhythmic lullaby that wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. However, something in the atmosphere shifted. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but Sarah felt it, a tension that crept into the corners of the room, whispering hints of unease. Dismissing it as a figment of her imagination, she pulled the covers tighter around herself, reminding herself to focus on the comforting weight of sleep. With her book resting on her chest, her eyelids grew heavy. She tried to concentrate on the words, but the warmth and the sound of rain were too inviting. Soon, she drifted off into a deep slumber, the sound of the rain lulling her further into dreams. But as the hours passed, the calm was shattered by a strange noise, a creaking sound that echoed through the stillness of the night. It pulled her from her dreams, heart racing, eyes snapping open to stare into the darkness. The clock on her bedside table read 2:13 a.m. The room was cast in shadows, and her breathing felt heavy in the silence that enveloped her. Sitting up slowly, she strained to listen. The creaking sound continued, a faint whisper against the silence of the night. Was it just her imagination, or was something moving in her apartment? Anxiety washed over her, and she quickly dismissed the thought. Perhaps it was just the old building settling, or maybe the wind was playing tricks on her. Yet, as she lay back down, trying to calm herself, a chill swept through the room, as if the very air had thickened with an unnameable weight. The hair on her arms stood on end, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Taking a deep breath, she sat up again, her heart pounding as she glanced around her dimly lit room. "Hello," she called out, her voice slightly trembling, betraying her calm facade. The room remained silent, the shadows flickering ominously in the dim light. Just as she began to convince herself that everything was fine, a chill crept down her spine. It felt as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. Then, in the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement at the foot of her bed. Instinctively, she turned her head sharply to look, but nothing was there. Just shadows and the soft glow of her bedside lamp. Heart racing, she tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, a primal fear gripped her, a fear of the unknown, of what lurked just beyond her line of sight. Gathering her courage, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cool wooden floor. Every instinct screamed at her to turn on the lights, to banish the shadows that seemed to swirl ominously around her. Slowly, she stood up, clutching her blanket tightly around her, half expecting someone to be waiting for her in the darkness. As she took a tentative step forward, the creaking sound returned, more pronounced this time, echoing ominously in the stillness. She turned toward the sound, heart pounding in her chest, her breath quickening. She felt a sense of dread pooling in her stomach, weighing her down like an anchor. Then she saw it again, a fleeting shadow at the foot of her bed, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there. Adrenaline surged through her veins, and she took a step back, instinctively reaching for her phone, the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. Flipping it on, she illuminated the room, revealing nothing but her own bed, the furniture, and the familiar shapes of her belongings. But the feeling of being watched intensified, and as her gaze returned to the foot of her bed, her heart stopped. Standing there, half illuminated by the soft glow of her phone, was a figure. Standing frozen in place, Sarah's heart raced as her mind struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. The figure at the foot of her bed was indistinct, shrouded in shadows, yet there was an unmistakable presence that sent chills racing down her spine. It was tall and seemed to loom over her, the darkness around it swirling like a living entity. Panic coursed through her veins as she blinked, hoping that when she opened her eyes again, the figure would vanish, leaving only the remnants of a nightmare. But it remained, unmoving, as if time had stopped. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, pressing down on her with an invisible weight. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet her legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. The gentle patter of rain outside faded into the background, replaced by the deafening sound of her heartbeat. "Who are you?" she finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling in the thick silence. The figure didn't respond, but she sensed it was watching her, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The moment stretched into eternity, the darkness of the room seeming to close in around her. In a flash of courage, she raised her phone higher, illuminating the figure more clearly. But as the light pierced through the shadows, the figure shimmered, as if it were made of smoke. The details blurred and danced away, leaving only a dark silhouette, a void against the backdrop of her brightly lit room. Fear gripped her, and she took a shaky step back, ready to retreat, to escape the confines of her own bedroom. "This isn't funny," she shouted, her voice rising with panic. "Get out! Leave me alone!" But the figure remained silent, unmoving. A wave of frustration, mixed with fear, washed over her. She wanted to believe this was some trick of the mind, an overactive imagination fueled by the fatigue of the day. But deep down, she felt the chilling reality of her situation, the unyielding truth that something was very wrong. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Sarah turned and ran towards her bedroom door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of her room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she flung the door open, but as she stepped into the hallway, she felt an invisible force pulling her back, urging her to turn around, to confront the shadow that lingered in her room. "Don't be ridiculous," she whispered to herself, shaking her head as if to clear the fog of fear clouding her thoughts. "It's just my mind playing tricks." Yet, even as she told herself this, the sense of dread lingered, gnawing at her courage. Gathering what remained of her resolve, she turned back to the room, the light from her phone illuminating the space. The figure was gone. In its place was her unmade bed, the blanket slightly askew from her restless sleep. The shadows were just shadows now, nothing more than the play of light and dark created by the moon filtering through her window. Relief washed over her, mingling with disbelief. She stepped back into her room, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The normalcy of her surroundings felt comforting, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She stood in the middle of the room, scanning every corner, the remnants of fear still prickling at her skin. But just as she began to convince herself it was over, she heard it again, the faint creaking sound from earlier, like a whisper echoing in the stillness. This time it came from her closet. Her stomach dropped and her body tensed. The closet door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. The idea of something hiding within filled her with dread. What if the figure hadn't left? What if it had only retreated into the shadows, biding its time? With her heart pounding, she approached the closet, the beam of her phone shaking as she held it in front of her. "If you're in there, you need to leave," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Nothing. The silence was almost palpable, thickening the air around her. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the door handle, her hand trembling. The moment she opened it, she prepared for the worst, for whatever might be lurking inside. As she pulled the door open, the darkness swallowed the light from her phone, revealing only a void filled with her clothes. She peered into the depths, half expecting to see eyes staring back at her. But all that greeted her was a gust of cold air that sent chills racing down her spine. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Perhaps it had just been her imagination, or perhaps the stress of her day had conjured some ghostly figment. Yet, even as she reassured herself, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was wrong, something sinister lurking just beyond her perception. Deciding to check her bedroom one last time, she stepped back into the room. The moonlight illuminated the space, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Everything looked normal, but the tension in the air was thick, and she felt the hairs on her arms rise again, a warning of what might come next. "Just go to sleep," she told herself firmly, trying to shake off the unease. She climbed back into bed, clutching her phone tightly, its light illuminating the darkness around her. But as she lay there, the sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. It was as if the shadows were alive, whispering secrets only they could understand. Then, just as she began to drift off again, she heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably there. It came from the corner of her room, a sound that felt like a caress against her ears. "Sarah," it called, the voice slithering through the air like smoke. "Sarah, Sarah," the voice, low and smooth, echoed around her, wrapping her in a cocoon of unease. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, each shadow stretching and morphing to bring the name to life. Her heart raced again, pounding so hard it felt as though it might burst from her chest. She was no longer just confronting an unknown presence. She was actively engaged in a sinister dialogue. "Who's there?" she croaked, her voice shaking despite her attempts to sound brave. The shadows shifted, and the air grew heavy, almost thick, as if it were imbued with a tangible fear. She held her breath, waiting for a response that she half hoped would never come. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic beating of her heart in her ears. Then, the whispers came again, this time more insistent, like a soft wind blowing through the trees, weaving between the floorboards and finding its way to her. "Sarah, come closer." Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from the unknown entity that had taken root in her life. Yet, some part of her, a dark curiosity, urged her to stay, to listen. What did it want? Slowly, she turned her head towards the source of the voice, which seemed to emanate from the darkened corner of her room. The shadows there were deeper, thicker, almost as if they had a weight of their own. And for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a dark shape melding with the darkness. "Please," she whispered, "just tell me what you want." The room fell silent for a moment, the absence of sound amplifying her fear. Was it truly gone, or was it just biding its time? The tension was unbearable. Then, with a sudden, sickening lurch, the figure materialized in her mind, an echo of what she had seen earlier. Its presence was both terrifying and oddly compelling, drawing her in against her better judgment. She closed her eyes tightly, trying to dispel the image, but it was etched into her memory. The tall, dark silhouette with no discernible features, just a void that seemed to consume the light around it. "Help me." The voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. "Sarah, please help me." Those words sent a shiver down her spine. Help? Who or what needed help? Was this some twisted game, or was it a genuine cry for assistance? The duality of fear and curiosity battled within her, and she felt herself teetering on the edge of a decision that could change everything. Gathering what courage she had left, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cool floor. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She felt ridiculous, talking to the dark as if it were a person, but something compelled her to engage. The shadows in the corner seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the closet, the voice drifted through the air, airy and uncertain, like a distant memory seeking to be remembered. The closet, the very place she had just searched. A wave of dread washed over her again, pooling in the pit of her stomach. If there was something trapped in there, something trying to reach out, what could it be? What if it was dangerous? What if it wasn't a plea for help at all, but rather a manipulation of her own fears? Sarah's mind raced, debating whether to run for her phone and call for help or to confront whatever lay in that closet. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was not a child anymore. She had to face her fears. She wasn't going to be paralyzed by the shadows any longer. With cautious steps, she made her way to the closet, her heart pounding louder with every step. The door stood slightly ajar, inviting yet foreboding, as if it had a will of its own. "I'm coming in," she announced, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. As she gripped the handle, she hesitated, momentarily frozen in fear. What if this was a terrible mistake? The thought of retreating crossed her mind, but the voice, soft and pleading, pulled her in. "I need you, Sarah." Summoning her courage, she flung the door open wide, flooding the darkened space with the beam of her phone. The clothes hanging inside swayed gently, creating a ghostly motion that sent her heart racing. She stepped closer, peering into the shadows, searching for any sign of life. "Hello? Is anyone there?" she called, her voice echoing in the small enclosure. The room remained silent, the shadows only moving in the flickering light of her phone. The air was cool and stale, filled with the scent of old fabric and dust. Then something caught her eye, a small box tucked away at the back of the closet, partially hidden behind a few garments. The box was unadorned, wooden, and worn, as if it had been there for years, waiting for someone to discover it. She hesitated, feeling an inexplicable pull towards it. What secrets did it hold? Was this box somehow connected to the figure, to the whispers, to the terror that had been haunting her? Without another thought, she knelt down, brushing aside a few shirts to reach the box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and as she pulled it into the light, She noticed strange carvings etched into the surface, symbols she didn't recognize. A chill ran down her spine as she traced her fingers over the carvings. What was this? Open it, the voice urged again, now softer and more insistent, almost desperate. Heart racing, she decided to comply. She took a deep breath and lifted the lid, feeling an electric charge in the air around her. Inside lay an assortment of items: old photographs, crumpled letters, and a small, tarnished key. As she picked up the photographs, she gasped. They were images of a family she didn't recognize, smiling in front of a house that looked eerily similar to her own. Confusion washed over her. What did this mean? Then, a realization dawned on her. What if this family had a connection to the figure? And what if that figure was tied to her in a way she couldn't yet understand? Before she could fully process the implications, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt charged, crackling with energy, and she sensed movement behind her. Panic surged, and she spun around, her phone illuminating the room once more. But there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, only the faint outline of her bed and the dark corners of her room. Yet, she could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes watching her, waiting. "Sarah," the voice whispered again, now sounding more urgent. "You have to find me?" As Sarah stood frozen, the whispers swirled around her, filling the air with an unsettling presence that sent shivers down her spine. She clutched the box tightly, her knuckles turning white. The room felt charged, and the shadows appeared to deepen, pressing against her as if they were alive, eager to swallow her whole. "Find me," the voice echoed softly, but now it was laced with an urgency that made her heart race. Something about it tugged at her insides, a desperate call that resonated deep within her core. Was it a plea for help, or a trap waiting to ensnare her? Breathing heavily, she closed her eyes for a moment, grappling with the weight of the decision before her. Should she continue down this rabbit hole of mystery? Or should she abandon this madness and escape to the safety of her family? She envisioned the figure again, the silhouette at the foot of her bed, the way it had loomed silently, patiently. What did it want? Why did it seem to know her name? Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet another part of her was filled with a morbid curiosity, urging her to uncover the truth. Gathering her courage, she set the box down on the floor and rummaged through its contents. The photographs felt cold in her hands, each one a piece of a forgotten puzzle. Faces of people she didn't recognize stared back at her, their smiles frozen in time. She flipped through them one by one. There was a couple, perhaps in their 30s, standing in front of a house that had to be at least 100 years old, its windows glinting in the sun. Beside them were children, a boy and a girl, their faces alight with joy. But in each photo, there was a sense of melancholy lurking just beneath the surface. Then, she found a faded letter, its edges frayed and yellowed with age. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, yet the words were laced with sorrow. As she read it, her breath caught in her throat. "Dear Clara, I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant for things to end this way. You must understand, it was the only way to protect you and the children. Please, if you find this, know that I love you and I will always be watching over you. Don't be afraid. I'll find a way back to you." Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine as she processed the letter's contents. Who was Clara? And what had happened to her? The urgency in the voice suddenly made sense. It was a call for help, but it was also a warning, a desperate reach through time and space. She glanced back at the closet, shadows shifting with each flicker of her phone's light. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered, more to herself than to the darkness. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. With a newfound determination, she stood up, clutching the box tightly to her chest. "I will find out what happened to you," she declared, though her voice quivered slightly. The shadows seemed to sway, and she could almost feel the figure's presence surrounding her, a ghostly encouragement pushing her forward. But the air in the room had shifted again. A heaviness settled over her, as if the darkness were alive and breathing, a creature lying in wait. The whispers had intensified, becoming a chaotic blend of urgency and despair. "Sarah, you must hurry. The door is closing. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed from the other side of her bedroom door. It shattered the silence, sending her heart racing as adrenaline coursed through her veins. "Sarah, are you okay?" It was her mother, her voice laced with concern. "Yes," she managed to reply, though it sounded hollow even to her ears. "I'm fine. Just a minute." The knocking persisted, growing louder, more frantic. "Sarah, open the door." "Hold on," she shouted back, but inside, panic clawed at her throat. How could she explain this to her mother? The looming darkness felt too powerful, too engulfing to share with anyone. Just then, Sarah's phone flickered, its battery icon flashing ominously, and the light dimmed. The whispers turned to frantic pleading. "The door, open it." With trembling hands, she approached the door. "Just a second," she called again, her heart racing. As she reached for the knob, a sudden chill swept through the room, freezing her in place. The whispers intensified, swirling around her like a storm. "You have to choose," they urged. "You can't let her take you away." "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cracking under the pressure. "Open it," the voice insisted, desperate and filled with urgency. Sarah's mind raced. Was her mother somehow part of this? Did she know? The idea was almost too much to bear, but there was no time for doubts. The figure in her room, the shadows that had haunted her, had become too real to ignore. With a surge of bravery, she twisted the doorknob and flung the door open. "Mom," she gasped, stepping into the hallway. Her mother stood there, worry etched across her face, eyes darting back and forth as if searching for something. "Thank God," her mother exclaimed, rushing in to pull Sarah into a tight embrace. "I heard you talking. I thought you were in trouble." I am fine," Sarah stammered, but she felt her resolve weakening. The weight of the secrets pressed against her. I need to talk to you about something." Her mother stepped back, concern deepening as she searched Sarah's face. "You're pale. Have you been sleeping okay?" "I don't think so," Sarah replied, glancing back into her darkened room. "But there's something in there, something I need to understand." Before her mother could respond, the whispers swirled around them, insistent and pleading. "Help us, Sarah! Help Clara!" The intensity of the moment gripped Sarah like a vice, and she turned back to her mother, her heart racing. "Mom, I need to show you something. Please." Without waiting for an answer, she led her mother back into the room, the box still sitting in the center of the floor, the photographs scattered around it like fallen leaves. "What is all this?" her mother asked, eyes wide as she took in the scene. It's connected to something," Sarah replied, voice trembling. "I don't understand it all yet, but I think it's important. I heard someone asking for help." Her mother knelt down beside the box, picking up a photograph. Her eyes softened as she studied the faces, confusion etched across her features. "Who are these people?" "I don't know," Sarah confessed, feeling a swell of fear and frustration. "But I think they might have lived here. Or something happened." As her mother examined the photographs, Sarah felt the weight of the shadows pressing closer, filling the room with an overwhelming dread. The whispers returned, insistent and dark, now filled with a sense of urgency that set her heart racing. "Don't trust her," they warned. "She can't help you." "Mom," Sarah said, glancing at her. "What if I'm being watched? What if—" "Sarah, you need to calm down," her mother interrupted, worry lacing her voice. "You're scaring me. Just listen," Sarah pleaded, desperate to be taken seriously. "I need you to help me figure this out. There's something wrong, and I can feel it." But even as she spoke, Sarah felt a strange pressure around her, as if the very air was constricting. Her mother's brows furrowed, and Sarah could see the flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "Maybe we should just go to bed," her mother suggested, a note of hesitance in her tone. "No!" Sarah cried, feeling panic rise within her. "We can't just ignore this. Please, there's a reason I heard the voice. I have to know what it means." Her mother hesitated, torn between fear and concern for her daughter. Just as she was about to respond, the shadows around them surged, the whispers rising to a fever pitch, drowning out everything else. "Sarah," the voice cried out, filled with anguish. "Don't let her take you. You must choose." "Choose what?" Sarah yelled, panic clawing at her throat. The room felt suffocating, the shadows stretching and writhing as if alive. Suddenly, the closet door swung open on its own, creaking eerily as it revealed the darkened void within. A blast of cold air rushed out, chilling Sarah to the bone, and the voice grew louder, urgent and desperate. "You must see. Mom, we have to go." Sarah screamed, the fear surging through her. But before they could move, the air crackled, and the whispers converged into one word: Clara. The walls seemed to tremble as the figure re-emerged, solidifying into the room. Sarah felt herself being pulled toward it, a magnetic force tugging at her very essence. She fought against it, clinging to her mother's arm. "Mom, don't let go." But the pull was too strong, and she felt her mother slip from her grasp. "Sarah," her mother cried, reaching out in desperation. "Help!" Sarah shouted, her voice echoing through the chaos. As she felt herself being dragged closer to the figure, time slowed. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. The warning, the photographs, the urgency of the voice. And in that moment of panic, Sarah made a choice. "Clara," she called out, forcing herself to break through the shadows. "I'm here. I want to help you." The room fell silent. The figure paused, and the whispers faded into an eerie hush. The shadows retreated, revealing the full outline of a woman with sorrowful eyes. "Thank you," the figure whispered, a tone of relief washing over the chaos. As Sarah stood frozen, the air around her shifted, the darkness dissipating like a fading nightmare. She blinked, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But the room remained still, and in that moment, she realized the figure was not there to harm her, but to guide her. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she looked into the figure's eyes. "Find me," it whispered, reaching out a hand as if inviting her to step forward. But just as Sarah felt the urge to comply, her mother grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "No, we're leaving." The figure faltered, its expression shifting to one of desperation, as shadows began to coil around it once more. "Sarah," her mother urged, fear in her voice. "Let's go." With a surge of strength, Sarah pulled herself free, feeling a newfound resolve. "I can't leave. I need to understand what happened to Clara." As she stepped closer, the figure's presence intensified, the air thick with anticipation. "Help me," it pleaded, a sense of urgency returning. "Tell me what you need," Sarah cried, heart racing as she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. But as she reached out, the figure began to flicker, the shadows twisting around it. "Hurry," it urged, the desperation in its voice cutting through the silence. "I'm trying," Sarah yelled, panic rising as she watched the figure dissolve into darkness. "Remember," it whispered, just before it vanished completely, "you must find the truth. Time is running out." The room fell silent, the oppressive weight of the shadows lifting. But the sense of urgency lingered, a chilling reminder of what was at stake. "Sarah, please," her mother pleaded, grasping her arm tightly. "Let's just go." Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. "What if I'm meant to find Clara? Then we'll find her together," her mother replied, eyes filled with worry. "But we need to think clearly, not rush into danger." After a moment's pause, Sarah nodded, though uncertainty churned in her gut. They stepped away from the remnants of the shadows, but the haunting urgency remained etched in her mind, a silent promise that their journey had only just begun. As they left the room, the last remnants of the whispers echoed in the silence, haunting and unyielding. "Find me, find Clara." The night stretched out before them, shrouded in darkness, and Sarah knew deep down that the battle had only just begun. The truth waited on the edge of shadows, and she was determined to uncover it, no matter what it took. Sarah and her mother retreated to the safety of the living room, the oppressive darkness of her bedroom lingering in their minds. The air felt different now, thick with unspoken words and unresolved mysteries. They sat on the couch, a silence stretching between them, both lost in thought as the echoes of the figure's desperate plea replayed in Sarah's mind. "What was that?" her mother finally asked, breaking the tension. Her voice trembled slightly, a mixture of concern and curiosity lacing her words. "What happened back there?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, feeling the weight of the box still in her hands. "But it was Clara. I think that's who the figure was." "Clara," her mother echoed, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Who is Clara?" "I don't know exactly," Sarah replied, her fingers tracing the edges of the box. "But I found this letter. It mentioned her. It feels like she's trying to reach out to me, to ask for help." Her mother looked at her, concern deepening in her eyes. "Sarah, this is really concerning. You've been through a lot tonight. Maybe we should just go to bed, sleep on it, and talk in the morning." "No." Sarah shook her head vehemently, her heart racing. "I can't just ignore this. Something is wrong, and I need to figure it out before it's too late." "Too late for what?" her mother asked, voice firm but laced with fear. "What do you think will happen?" Sarah hesitated, the urgency in her chest intensifying. "I don't know, but the whispers, they said time is running out." Her mother sighed, rubbing her temples as if trying to alleviate the mounting stress. "We can't just jump to conclusions. We need to think clearly." A sudden determination surged within Sarah. "What if we could find out more about Clara? About this house? Maybe there's a reason I saw that figure." Her mother looked skeptical, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "You really believe this is connected to Clara?" "I do," Sarah said firmly, clutching the box. "It's like there's a thread connecting everything. If I could just pull it, maybe we'd uncover the truth." "Okay." Her mother relented, albeit reluctantly. "But we need to be careful. This isn't something we can take lightly." They began searching through the box together, picking up photographs and letters, each one revealing pieces of a forgotten past. One photo caught Sarah's eye, a group of children playing in a yard that looked strikingly familiar, the old house in the background almost identical to theirs. "Look," she exclaimed, pointing it out to her mother. "This yard is just like ours." Her mother squinted at the image, the children's laughter frozen in time. "It does look familiar. Do you think this was taken in our backyard?" "I think so, but that doesn't make any sense. How could we not know?" They rummaged through the box further, pulling out more photographs, each revealing more of Clara's life. The pictures captured moments of joy, birthdays celebrated, family gatherings, but they also hinted at a shadow lurking in the background, a sense of unease that seemed to grow with each passing year. Then Sarah found another letter, this one addressed to Clara's husband. It was filled with apologies and regret, mentioning a promise made long ago and an impending darkness threatening their happiness. As she read it aloud, her voice trembled with emotion. "My dearest, I am writing this in the hopes that you will forgive me. I never meant for things to go this way. I promise to find a way to protect you and the children from what's coming. Please trust me and know that I will always love you, no matter what happens." "What is this?" her mother asked, a look of concern washing over her features. "It sounds serious." "I think Clara was in danger," Sarah said, her heart racing. "She was trying to protect her family from something dark." Her mother took a deep breath, her face pale. "This is too much. We need to talk to someone about this." "Who?" Sarah shot back, frustration boiling over. "What are we supposed to say? That we're haunted by a ghost? No one would believe us. Maybe we should try to find out more about the history of the house. There might be something in the local archives or the library," her mother suggested, her voice calmer now. "That could work," Sarah agreed, feeling a flicker of hope. "If we can learn about Clara and her family, maybe we can understand what happened." They spent the next hour poring over the contents of the box, their minds racing with possibilities. Each photograph, each letter felt like a breadcrumb leading them deeper into the mystery, and Sarah's heart ached with the weight of it all. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to creep in, but the urgency still thrummed within her. "Mom," she said, glancing at the clock, "we have to do this now. We can't wait until morning." "Sarah, it's late. We need to rest," her mother insisted, but the determination in Sarah's eyes made her pause. "Please, just one more hour. Let's find out who Clara was and what happened here." Her mother sighed, finally relenting. "Fine, one more hour." They continued their search, uncovering more fragments of Clara's life. Each item, was a piece of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every discovery. They stumbled upon an old diary, its pages filled with Clara's thoughts, revealing her hopes, dreams, and fears. Sarah flipped through the pages, her heart racing as she read Clara's entries. The entries started innocently enough, family outings, celebrations, but then they took a dark turn. Clara wrote about strange occurrences in the house, whispers that echoed through the halls at night, shadows lurking just out of sight. "I can't shake the feeling that something is watching us," one entry read. "I have to protect my family. I don't know what's coming, but I can feel it creeping closer." "This is exactly what I felt," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She was experiencing the same thing. Her mother leaned closer, the fear etched in her features deepening as they both absorbed the gravity of Clara's words. "What do you think happened to her?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her throat tight. "But whatever it was, it must have been powerful." Suddenly, a loud bang reverberated through the house, shaking them from their thoughts. They exchanged frightened glances, both realizing that the noise had come from Sarah's bedroom. "What was that?" her mother whispered, eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her heart racing. "But I think we should check." Reluctantly, they stood up, moving cautiously toward the bedroom. Each step felt heavier than the last, the shadows growing thicker as they approached the door. Sarah reached for the handle, her heart pounding in her chest, and pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, but the air felt charged, electric with an unspoken tension. They stepped inside, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw what had caused the noise. The box lay open on the floor, its contents scattered around the room as if someone had rifled through it in a hurry. "What the?" her mother murmured, stepping further into the room. Sarah's heart raced as she scanned the space, looking for any sign of the figure. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What?" her mother asked, eyes wide with alarm. "I thought I saw something move," Sarah replied, feeling a chill creep down her spine. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the closet, making them both jump. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run. "We need to go." But just as she turned to leave, a faint voice echoed from the darkness, whispering her name once more. "Sarah, Mom, let's go," she urged, grabbing her mother's arm. But something compelled her to stay, to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. "Please, help me." The voice was softer now, almost pleading. "Is that Clara?" her mother asked, fear written across her face. "Maybe," Sarah replied, her voice steadying. "But we can't just leave her." Gathering her courage, Sarah stepped forward, her heart racing as she approached the closet. The whispers seemed to grow louder, swirling around her like a tempest. "Help me find me." As she opened the closet door, the air turned frigid, and she could see a figure standing there, its outline shimmering in the darkness. "Clara," she called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. The figure didn't move, but Sarah could feel the weight of its gaze upon her, urging her forward. "Help me find the truth." The shadows closed in, and as Sarah reached out, she felt the unmistakable pull of the unknown. The weight of Clara's past pressed down on her, a call for help that ignited a fierce determination within. "I'll help you," Sarah promised, her voice steady as she took a step closer. "I won't let you down." The shadows flickered, and for a brief moment, the figure smiled, a glimmer of hope illuminating its sorrowful features. But just as quickly, it faded back into darkness, leaving Sarah standing alone, the echoes of the past still swirling around her. "Sarah," her mother called out, breaking her concentration. "We need to go." "I can't," Sarah whispered, feeling the gravity of Clara's plea weighing heavily on her heart. "I have to understand." Her mother hesitated, then stepped closer. "Okay, but we need to be careful. I don't want anything to happen to you." "I know," Sarah replied, her resolve strengthening. "But I'm going to find Clara. I promise." The room fell silent, the oppressive darkness lingering as they stood together, united in their quest for the truth. As they began to search for more clues, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The shadows felt closer now, a reminder of the urgency that hung heavy in the air. Clara needed them, and Sarah was determined to uncover the secrets of the past, no matter the cost. The next morning arrived, heavy with anticipation. Sarah awoke, the events of the previous night still vivid in her mind. Clara's pleading voice echoed in her ears, and the weight of the mysteries surrounding the locked room and the figure at her bed was almost unbearable. Determined to find answers, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool floor beneath her feet, and headed to the living room where her mother was already brewing coffee. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We need to go to the library today. I want to find out everything I can about Clara in this house." Her mother looked up, concern etched across her features. "Are you sure you're ready for this? Last night was intense." "I know," Sarah replied, "but I can't shake the feeling that Clara is trying to tell me something important. If we can find out more about her, maybe we can help her find peace." Her mother took a deep breath, weighing her daughter's words. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, let's go. But we need to be cautious. This is uncharted territory." As they drove to the local library, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. What if Clara had left clues behind? What if the answers were hidden in the dusty archives of their town's history? The excitement bubbled within her, but it was tempered by the lingering unease that haunted her thoughts. Upon arriving, they entered the library, the musty scent of old books enveloping them like a familiar embrace. The towering shelves seemed to whisper secrets of the past, and Sarah felt a surge of hope. "Where should we start?" she asked her mother, glancing around the dimly lit room. "Let's check the local history section first," her mother suggested. There might be books or records about the previous owners of the house. They made their way to the section filled with dusty tomes and weathered encyclopedias. Sarah began to scour the shelves, her fingers brushing against the spines of the books, searching for anything related to her home. After several minutes, her mother pulled out a book titled Echoes of Our Past, A History of Maplewood. "Look at this," she said, flipping through the pages. "It mentions families that lived in this area." Sarah leaned over her mother's shoulder, her heart racing as she scanned the pages. "What does it say?" "There's a section about the Winstons, a family that lived in our house back in the 1970s, her mother read aloud. "They had 3 children and were known for their community involvement. However, tragedy struck when their youngest daughter disappeared under mysterious circumstances." "Disappeared?" Sarah echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to her?" Her mother continued reading, her brow furrowing. "It says that Clara, their daughter, was last seen playing in the yard. Despite extensive searches, she was never found. The family was devastated, and they moved away shortly after." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Clara's fate was tied to her own home, and the implications were horrifying. "Is there more?" she urged, her heart racing. "Yes," her mother replied, flipping through the pages. "It also mentions strange occurrences reported by neighbors. Whispers at night, shadows moving in the windows, and some even claim to see Clara's ghost wandering the yard." "Ghost?" Sarah's heart pounded. "What else does it say?" "Just that after the family left, the house was abandoned for several years before it was sold to the next owner," her mother said, her voice trembling slightly. But the story of Clara seemed to linger in the community. Sarah's mind raced. This was it. Clara was tied to the house in ways she hadn't fully understood before. "We need to find out more about the Winstons," she said, her determination solidifying. They could hold the key to understanding what happened here. They spent the next few hours poring over old newspapers and local archives, uncovering more about Clara's family. Sarah learned that Clara had been a vibrant girl, loved by her siblings and the community. But as the articles revealed, her disappearance had cast a shadow over the family, leading to whispers and speculation that never quite faded. "Look at this," her mother said, pointing to a faded newspaper clipping. This article was published just weeks after Clara disappeared. It mentions sightings of her in the woods near the house, claiming some residents saw a girl in a white dress wandering alone. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine as she read the article. "It's like she's been trapped," she said, her heart aching for Clara. She needs help to move on. As they continued their search, Sarah began to piece together a timeline of Clara's life. The more they learned, the clearer it became that something sinister had happened. But the missing pieces weighed heavily on her mind, and the urgency to uncover the truth intensified. "We should see if there are any remaining family members," Sarah suggested. "Maybe they can shed light on what happened to Clara." Her mother nodded in agreement. "That's a good idea, but we have to be careful. This could bring up painful memories." They scoured the local archives for any leads and discovered that the Winston family had moved to a neighboring town. With newfound determination, Sarah suggested they reach out to them. Back home, they found contact information for a cousin of Clara's who had remained in the area. Sarah's heart raced as she dialed the number, anxiety mingling with hope. After a few rings, a soft voice answered. "Hello. Hi, is this Lily?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, this is she," the woman replied, her tone warm but wary. "Who is this?" "My name is Sarah, and I live in the old Winston house. I've been researching Clara, and I believe she's trying to reach out to me." There was a brief silence on the other end before Lily spoke again, her voice low. "Clara, my cousin. I thought we lost her forever. Do you know what happened to her?" Sarah pressed, feeling the urgency of the situation. Lily took a deep breath, her voice heavy with emotion. "It's a painful story. We searched for Clara for months, but she was never found. The family was torn apart by her disappearance. Some believe she was taken, while others say she was trying to find her way home." Sarah felt a chill grip her heart. "I've seen her, or at least a figure that resembles her. She's tried to tell me something. I need to know what happened." "Meet me tomorrow," Lily said suddenly, her tone shifting. "There's so much to discuss, and I believe you might hold the key to finding her." "I'll be there," Sarah replied, feeling a surge of determination. After hanging up, Sarah turned to her mother, excitement bubbling within her. "I think we're getting closer. Lily knows something. Just remember to stay grounded," her mother cautioned. "We don't know what we're walking into." "I know," Sarah reassured her, "but I can't back down now." That night, Sarah lay in bed, anticipation swirling within her. The whispers of Clara echoed in her mind, urging her to uncover the truth. With every passing moment, she felt the weight of the past pressing closer, but she also felt a glimmer of hope. Tomorrow, she would meet Lily, and hopefully, they could piece together the story of Clara once and for all. As she closed her eyes, sleep eluded her, replaced by the haunting presence of the figure standing at the foot of her bed, waiting for her to make sense of the enigma that bound them both. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the bright rays of sunlight streaming through her window, dispelling the shadows of the night. Excitement mixed with anxiety bubbled inside her as she prepared to meet Lily. She dressed quickly, her mind racing with questions. Would Lily have the answers she sought? What secrets about Clara and the house would be unveiled today? Her mother made breakfast, but Sarah found it hard to concentrate on anything except the impending meeting. "Are you nervous?" her mother asked, noticing Sarah's fidgeting. "A little," Sarah admitted, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. "But mostly I just want to know the truth." After breakfast, they made their way to the address Lily had provided. It was a quaint house located a few streets away, with flower boxes filled with vibrant blooms that seemed to sway gently in the breeze. As they approached, Sarah's heart raced with anticipation. She could feel the weight of Clara's story pressing on her, urging her to uncover the truth. Lily greeted them at the door, her expression a mixture of warmth and concern. "Thank you for coming," she said, ushering them inside. The living room was cozy, filled with family photographs and a comforting scent of freshly brewed coffee. "Thank you for inviting us," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I hope we can help Clara find peace." Lily nodded, leading them to a plush sofa where they all sat down. "I've been waiting for someone to come and ask about Clara. It feels like she's been forgotten, and it's painful to carry that weight alone." "I've seen her," Sarah confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard her voice, and I saw a figure at the foot of my bed. It felt real, and I think she's trying to tell me something." Lily's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "That sounds just like Clara. She always had a way of reaching out to those she cared about." Even in death, I believe she wants to be heard. Can you tell us what happened? Sarah asked, leaning forward, her heart pounding. Lily took a deep breath, her expression somber. Clara was my favorite cousin. She was full of life, always laughing and playing. But that all changed the day she disappeared. We searched for weeks, but nothing ever came of it. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Did anyone ever see her after that? Sarah pressed, feeling the urgency of Clara's presence surrounding them. A few neighbors claimed to see a girl in a white dress wandering near the woods, Lily replied, her voice trembling. But no one could find her. The police said she might have gotten lost or worse. It was a nightmare for our family. Have you ever tried to contact her spirit? To see if she could tell you what happened? Sarah asked, her curiosity piqued. Lily shook her head. I've thought about it, but it's terrifying to confront those memories. The pain of losing her is still fresh for me. I've tried to move on, but Clara has never truly left my heart. We might have a chance to reach her, Sarah said, determination surging within her. If we can find a way to communicate, we might finally uncover the truth of what happened to her. Lily looked at Sarah, hope flickering in her eyes. What do you have in mind? I've done some research about paranormal communication. I know some techniques to try to reach out to spirits. If you're willing, we could attempt to contact Clara, Sarah explained. I'm willing to try, Lily said, her voice steadying. I need to know what happened to her. With a sense of purpose, Sarah pulled out her notebook, filled with the notes and observations she had made since she first heard Clara's voice. We can create a quiet space, light some candles, and try to communicate. Clara might respond to familiar items or names. Lily nodded, her expression serious. We should honor her memory. Let's gather things that belong to her. The three of them began to search the house for items related to Clara. They found an old teddy bear in the attic, a childhood drawing pinned to the wall, and a small locket that Clara used to wear, containing a picture of her family. Each item seemed to vibrate with energy, reminding them of the girl who had been lost. Once they had everything, they moved to the living room, transforming the space into a makeshift altar. Sarah lit the candles and arranged the items carefully, creating a serene atmosphere. Now we need to focus, she said softly. We'll each take a moment to think of Clara and send our love to her. As they sat in a circle, Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the candles flickering against her skin. She took a deep breath, channeling her energy into the room, trying to connect with Clara. She could feel the presence surrounding them, the air thick with anticipation. Clara, if you're here, please show us a sign, she whispered, her heart racing. We want to help you. We want to understand. Lily and Sarah's mother joined in, their voices echoing in the stillness. Minutes passed, and the only sound was the faint crackle of the candles. Suddenly, the room felt colder, and Sarah's skin prickled with a sense of urgency. Did you feel that? Lily asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Sarah replied, opening her eyes. I think she's here. At that moment, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah's heart raced as she focused on the items before them. Clara, if you can hear us, please give us a sign. Just then, the teddy bear on the table shifted slightly, as if moved by an unseen hand. Gasps filled the room as they exchanged startled glances. Clara, Sarah called, feeling a surge of excitement. Can you tell us what happened to you? Why are you still here? The candles flickered violently, and for a brief moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw a figure appear at the edge of her vision. Her heart raced as she turned, desperate to catch a glimpse. Clara, please! A voice echoed through the room, faint yet familiar. Help me! Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she realized Clara was trying to reach out. What do you need? How can we help you? The room fell silent, and the temperature dropped further. Lily clutched the locket tightly, her expression a mix of fear and hope. Clara, we're here for you. We want to help you find peace. With that, a gentle breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. Sarah's heart pounded as she fought the urge to panic. Clara, she shouted into the void, desperate for a response. The darkness enveloped them, but in that moment of fear, Sarah felt a sense of clarity wash over her. Clara was still there, her presence palpable, and she would not give up until she uncovered the truth. "Let's not give in to fear," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We need to stay strong. Clara, we are here for you. Please guide us." As the darkness lingered, a faint glow began to illuminate the room, revealing Clara's figure standing at the edge, shrouded in ethereal light. Sarah's breath hitched as she took in the sight, heart racing. "Help me," Clara's voice echoed again, clearer now, as she reached out toward them. "Clara, we're going to help you," Sarah promised, feeling an overwhelming sense of purpose. "We just need to understand what happened to you." With every ounce of courage she could muster, Sarah reached out, determined to bridge the gap between the living and the lost. The soft glow that illuminated the room flickered like a candle flame caught in a gentle breeze. Sarah's heart raced as she met Clara's ethereal gaze, a mix of fear and resolve surging within her. The moment felt surreal. It was as if time had stopped, leaving only the two of them suspended in a realm between the living and the dead. "Clara," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and determination. "Can you tell us what happened? Why are you trapped here?" The figure before her seemed to shift, the light wrapping around Clara like a mist, but the sorrow in her eyes remained unmistakable. "Help me," she echoed again, her voice carrying an echo of desperation. Lily, seated beside Sarah, clutched the locket tighter, her expression a blend of hope and fear. "What do you need, Clara? We want to help you find peace," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her heart. As if responding to their pleas, Clara's figure began to take shape, her features becoming clearer. Sarah could see the familiar outline of the girl she had seen in her dreams. The white dress Clara wore appeared tattered and worn, a reflection of the struggles she had endured. I can't remember," Clara murmured, her voice fading in and out like a distant echo. "Try, Clara. Focus on us," Sarah urged, her determination flaring. "You are not alone anymore. We're here for you." A flicker of recognition crossed Clara's face, and she began to speak, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "I remember the woods. I was playing, then I got lost." "The woods," Lily repeated, her voice sharp with clarity. "Was there someone with you?" Clara hesitated, her expression clouding with confusion. "There was a man, he scared me." Her eyes darted around, as if trying to grasp at fleeting memories. "I ran. I wanted to go home." "Clara, what happened after you ran?" Sarah pressed, feeling the urgency of the moment. "Did he catch you?" The atmosphere in the room shifted, the air growing heavy with unspoken fears. He took me," Clara stammered, her form flickering like a candle flame. "I tried to scream, but no one could hear me." Lily gasped, tears welling in her eyes as she processed the gravity of Clara's revelation. "Oh, Clara," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. We never stopped looking for you." As Clara's form began to flicker again, Sarah felt a deep surge of compassion. "Clara, you don't have to relive this alone. You have us now. We will help you remember everything." Clara's expression softened, the fear in her eyes mingling with hope. "You promise?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I promise," Sarah replied, her voice firm and reassuring. "Together, we can find the truth and set you free." The room fell silent, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the world had paused around them. Sarah could sense the power of their shared intentions, the strength of their collective desire to uncover the truth, reverberating in the air like a living pulse. Suddenly, Clara's figure began to shimmer, her outline becoming less distinct. "The woods, they're important," she said, urgency creeping into her tone. "You must find the place where I was taken." As Clara's figure faded, Sarah felt a wave of energy surge through her, a mixture of exhilaration and fear. "We will," she vowed, determination etching itself into her mind. "We will find the woods, and we will uncover the truth." The room darkened again as Clara's presence seemed to wane, leaving behind a lingering sense of urgency. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart still pounding with adrenaline. "We have to go to the woods," she said, her voice steady. Lily nodded, her expression resolute. Let's gather everything we need and go now. Clara deserves to be found. As they prepared to leave, Sarah's mother looked at them, concern etched on her face. Are you sure this is wise? The woods can be dangerous, especially at night. We have to do this, Sarah insisted, determination fueling her words. Clara is counting on us. We can't turn back now. With a few essentials packed into a backpack, flashlights, water, and the items they had gathered in honor of Clara, they set off towards the woods. The streets were eerily quiet, the twilight casting long shadows that danced along the pavement. As they reached the edge of the woods, Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The trees loomed ahead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. This is it, she whispered, glancing back at Lily and her mother, who both looked equally apprehensive. Stay close, her mother urged, clutching her flashlight tightly. We'll stick together. Stepping into the forest felt like entering another world, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant sounds of rustling leaves. The path ahead seemed to twist and turn, shadows flickering in the corners of Sarah's vision. Do you think Clara is here? She asked, her heart racing as they ventured deeper into the woods. Maybe she is, Lily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. We have to keep our minds open. If she can hear us, she might guide us to where she was taken. As they walked, Sarah felt an undeniable pull guiding her steps, as if Clara's spirit was leading them deeper into the heart of the woods. The trees whispered secrets in the wind, their branches swaying like ancient guardians watching over them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. The moon shone down, illuminating a small, crumbling structure that resembled a forgotten cabin. What is this place? Sarah asked, and dread mingling in her chest. I've never seen it before, Lily replied, her eyes wide with curiosity. But it feels significant. As they approached, Sarah felt a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding that made her stomach twist. We should be careful, her mother warned, scanning the surroundings. We need to go inside, Sarah insisted, feeling an inexplicable urgency. This might be where Clara was taken. With their flashlights illuminating the dark interior, they stepped inside the cabin. Dust motes danced in the beams of light, and the air felt heavy with the weight of untold stories. Old furniture lay scattered around, covered in a thick layer of dust, as if time had forgotten this place. Clara, are you here? Sarah called softly, her voice echoing off the walls. We're here to help you. A sudden gust of wind swept through the cabin, making the windows rattle. Sarah shivered, gripping her flashlight tightly. This place feels wrong, her mother murmured, her eyes wide with fear. As they moved deeper into the cabin, they stumbled upon a small room at the back, the door slightly ajar. Sarah pushed it open, her heart racing. The room was dimly lit by a single ray of moonlight, revealing a dusty old bed and walls that were lined with faded photographs. Look, Lily exclaimed, pointing to a photo on the wall. It's Clara. The image was old, but it captured Clara's vibrant smile, her eyes sparkling with life. But beside her stood a shadowy figure, a man whose features were obscured by darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she felt the air grow heavier. Who is he? Sarah whispered, fear creeping into her heart. I don't know, Lily said, her voice trembling. But he feels familiar, like a part of the story we haven't uncovered yet. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere in the cabin, causing them all to jump. What was that? Sarah's mother exclaimed, her voice filled with panic. Stay close, Sarah commanded, her heart racing. They moved cautiously toward the source of the noise, the darkness swallowing them whole. As they approached the main room, Sarah felt a pull toward a corner where the shadows seemed to deepen. There, half hidden by debris, lay a small wooden box. What is this? She wondered aloud. Lily bent down to examine it. It looks like it's been here a while, she replied. Should we open it? Let's see what's inside, Sarah said, curiosity overriding her fear. With trembling hands, Lily opened the box, revealing a collection of old trinkets, each one carrying a heavy weight of nostalgia. A rusted key, a faded diary, and a small locket similar to the one they had found at Lily's house. "Clara," Sarah whispered, hoping against hope that they were on the verge of unlocking the mystery of her disappearance. As the room grew colder, Sarah felt the presence of Clara enveloping them. "Help me," the voice echoed, a chilling reminder of the urgency that had brought them here. "Clara, we're trying to help you," Sarah cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. "We need to know what happened to you." The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows in the room seemed to swirl around them. "Find the truth," Clara's voice resonated clearer now, as if she were standing right beside them. Suddenly, the locket began to glow, its light illuminating the room. Sarah's heart raced as she reached for it, recognizing the familiar symbol engraved on its surface, the same one she had seen in her dreams. "Is this yours, Clara?" Sarah asked, holding the locket tightly. "Is this the key to your past?" As the locket pulsed with energy, the photographs on the wall began to shift, the faces of the past blending together into a haunting montage of memories. Sarah felt a rush of emotions, each image revealing fragments of Clara's life, a life cut short. With every heartbeat, the shadows danced around them, weaving the stories of Clara's past into a tapestry of truth and tragedy. Sarah knew they were on the brink of discovering something monumental, something that would lead them closer to understanding what had happened. "Let's keep going," she urged, her voice steady as she stepped deeper into the unfolding mystery. "We owe it to Clara to uncover the truth, no matter how frightening it may be." As they ventured further into the darkness, the whispers of the past guided them, illuminating a path toward redemption and understanding. Together, they would unravel the threads of Clara's story and finally bring her the peace she had longed for. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as Sarah, Lily, and Sarah's mother pressed deeper into the haunting remnants of Clara's life. With every step, the air grew heavier, and the shadows seemed to pulse with the energy of secrets long buried. Sarah clutched the locket tightly, feeling its warmth against her palm, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. As they moved through the dimly lit space, the whispers of the past echoed in their ears. "Find the truth," Clara's voice lingered, guiding them toward answers buried in the cabin's depths. They ventured into the far corner, where old furniture lay stacked haphazardly, remnants of a life once lived. "What do you think is hidden back here?" Lily asked, her voice low as she glanced around, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. "I don't know, but it feels like something important," Sarah replied, her heartbeat quickening. "If Clara wants us to find the truth, it must be here somewhere." With a deep breath, Sarah began to clear away the debris. Dust flew into the air, catching the light in a shimmering haze as she unearthed an old trunk, its once bright color dulled by years of neglect. "Help me with this," she said, motioning for Lily and her mother to assist. Together, they pried open the trunk, the hinges creaking like the voice of an old ghost. Inside, they found a collection of items that appeared to be personal belongings: a faded dress, a stuffed bear with one eye missing, and a stack of yellowed letters tied with fraying ribbon. "What is all this?" Lily whispered, lifting the letters with trembling fingers. "Clara's things," Sarah replied, her heart aching at the sight. "She must have kept them close." As they began to sift through the contents, Sarah's fingers brushed against the stuffed bear. The familiar weight and warmth of the toy stirred memories within her, a feeling of safety and innocence that felt worlds away from the darkness surrounding them now. "Look at this," her mother said, holding up one of the letters. It was addressed to Clara, the handwriting elegant yet shaky, as if penned by someone who struggled with their emotions. "Read it," Sarah urged, her eyes wide with anticipation. Her mother unfolded the letter carefully, her voice soft as she began to read. "My dear Clara, if you ever feel lost or afraid, remember that you are loved beyond measure. No matter what happens, I will always be with you. Please don't wander too far into the woods. The shadows can be dangerous." Tension hung in the air as her mother finished reading. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, her brow furrowing. "Who wrote this? And why would Clara feel the need to wander if someone cared for her?" I don't know, but it sounds like someone was trying to protect her, Lily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's thoughts raced as she processed the implications of the letter. Maybe it was someone close to her, perhaps a parent or sibling. Whoever wrote this knew about the dangers in the woods. Her mother nodded, pulling out another letter from the trunk. This one had a different tone, more urgent and frantic. There's something off about this one, she remarked, unfolding it. Clara, you need to listen to me. I'm worried about you. If you see him, don't go near him. Please stay away from the old tree at the edge of the woods. I'm begging you. What does that mean? Sarah asked, her voice rising with anxiety. Who is him? I don't know, but whoever it is, they must have scared Clara, Lily added, her eyes scanning the letter. We need to find out who this person is. As Sarah searched through the trunk, she found a small, dusty journal tucked away at the bottom. Its cover was worn, but the pages within were filled with Clara's neat handwriting. With a sense of urgency, she began to read aloud. Dear Diary, today I found a beautiful butterfly in the woods. It was so bright and colorful, but I couldn't find my way back home. I wandered too far again. I just wanted to explore. I wish I could tell someone. Sarah paused, her heart aching for Clara's innocent longing. She felt trapped, she murmured. She wanted to be free, but something held her back. Continuing to read, she discovered more entries, each one revealing a glimpse into Clara's world. A world filled with joy and innocence, but also tinged with fear and confusion. Clara wrote about her love for exploring the woods, her fascination with the unknown, but she also hinted at a looming threat, a darkness that seemed to follow her. Dear Diary, I saw him again today, the man in the shadows. He watches me when I play. I don't like it. I wish I could tell someone, but I'm afraid. Who is he? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she shared Clara's words. What did he want? I don't know, but we need to find out, Lily insisted, her eyes wide with determination. We owe it to Clara to uncover what happened to her. As they sifted through the trunk, the final entry made Sarah's breath hitch in her throat. Dear Diary, I'm scared. I can feel something dark in the woods, something that doesn't want me to leave. I don't want to be alone anymore. I'm going to hide. The weight of Clara's words sank into Sarah's chest, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She was scared for a reason. We need to get to the bottom of this, she declared. Just then, a noise echoed through the cabin, a soft rustling, like leaves in the wind. Did you hear that? Sarah's mother asked, her voice laced with fear. Yeah, Lily replied, her eyes darting around the room. We should be careful. The air grew thick with tension, and Sarah felt a cold breeze sweep through the cabin, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Clara, Sarah called out, her voice trembling. Are you here with us? The shadows seemed to thicken, wrapping around them like a shroud. Help me, Clara's voice echoed through the room, soft yet urgent. Clara, we're trying, Sarah cried, her heart racing. But we need to know more. Just then, the walls of the cabin creaked ominously, as if responding to her plea. The woods, they're waiting. Clara's voice faded, leaving behind an unsettling silence. What does that mean? Lily asked, panic creeping into her voice. I think it means we need to confront whatever is lurking in the woods, Sarah replied, her resolve solidifying. We can't leave Clara like this. As they gathered the letters and the journal, a sudden realization struck Sarah. The old tree. It must be significant. If Clara was warned to stay away, it could be where she encountered the man. Her mother nodded, glancing back toward the entrance of the cabin. We should go before it gets any later. With determination, they set out into the woods once more, the moonlight guiding their path as they moved toward the old tree Clara had mentioned. The whispers of the past surrounded them, urging them forward. As they approached the ancient tree, its gnarled branches stretched out like skeletal fingers, casting eerie shadows on the ground. A sense of foreboding settled in the air, and Sarah felt her heart pound in her chest. Are you ready? Her mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ready as I'll ever be, Sarah replied, steeling herself as they moved closer. We're here for you, Clara. As they reached the base of the tree, Sarah noticed something unusual. a series of marks etched into the bark, deep and deliberate. "What are these?" she asked, bending down to examine them. "They look like scratch marks," Lily said, her voice tinged with unease. "Almost like someone was trying to climb up or down, or maybe someone was trying to get away," Sarah murmured, her heart racing as she traced the lines with her fingers. "Clara!" Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, causing the branches to sway violently. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she glanced around, half expecting to see Clara's ghostly figure emerge from the shadows. "Do you feel that?" Lily asked, shivering. "Yes," Sarah said, her heart pounding. "It feels like we're being watched." Just then, they heard a low growl emanating from the depths of the woods, sending a surge of fear through them. "We should go back," her mother urged, anxiety lacing her tone. "No," Sarah insisted, her resolve strengthening. "We need to confront whatever is here. Clara is counting on us." As they stood beneath the ancient tree, the air crackled with tension. They knew they were on the verge of uncovering something monumental, a dark truth that had been buried for too long. "Clara, if you're here, show us the way," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. In that moment, the wind picked up again, swirling around them like a living thing, and Sarah felt a surge of energy radiating from the tree. The bark seemed to shimmer, and for an instant, she thought she saw Clara standing among the shadows, her expression one of hope and fear. "Help me," Clara's voice echoed, a faint whisper that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. "Let's do this," Sarah said, her heart racing as she took a step forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. With determination coursing through her veins, Sarah stepped closer to the ancient tree, its massive trunk looming like a sentinel in the darkness. The air around them felt charged, as if the very fabric of reality was shifting in response to their presence. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, a relentless drumbeat urging her forward. "Clara, we're here to help you," Sarah called out, her voice echoing through the quiet woods. "Show us what happened." As if in response, the wind howled through the branches, sending a flurry of leaves spiraling around them. For a moment, Sarah could almost see Clara's silhouette among the shadows, her expression one of desperation mixed with hope. The whispers of the past intensified, swirling around Sarah like a whirlwind, urging her to remember the stories she had heard growing up. Her mother and Lily stood close behind, their faces etched with concern, but also a shared sense of purpose. "What if we're not alone?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "What if he's watching us?" "He won't hurt us," Sarah replied firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at her insides. "We're not here to provoke anything. We just want to know the truth." With her heart racing, Sarah knelt by the base of the tree, examining the scratch marks etched into the bark. "These marks, they're too deep to be from a child," she murmured. What if Clara wasn't the only one who was scared? Her mother knelt beside her, running her fingers along the bark. "It's like someone was trying to escape," she said softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "Maybe she was trying to warn us about something." As they gathered their thoughts, the wind suddenly shifted, and Sarah felt an unsettling presence behind them. She turned, half expecting to see Clara's spirit, but instead, her eyes widened in horror as a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, standing at the edge of the clearing. "Stay back," her mother shouted, instinctively positioning herself in front of Sarah and Lily. The figure remained still, its outline indistinct and hazy, as if the very air around it warped and twisted. A low, guttural growl emanated from the shadow, sending chills down Sarah's spine. Her heart raced, the fear palpable in the air. "Clara," Sarah called out, hoping against hope that the spirit of the girl would guide them through this encounter. For a moment, the shadow seemed to hesitate, flickering like a candle in the wind. Then, with an eerie stillness, it began to move closer, the darkness stretching toward them as if drawn by an unseen force. "Run!" Lily shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. But something rooted Sarah in place, a powerful urge to confront whatever this entity was. "No, we can't run. We need to face it," she insisted, her voice trembling but resolute. As the figure advanced, Sarah's mind raced. "Clara, if you're with us, give us a sign," she pleaded, desperation creeping into her tone. In that instant, the wind picked up again, swirling violently around them. The shadow hesitated, and suddenly, a flicker of light illuminated the clearing. A vision of Clara appeared before them, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "Help me!" Clara's voice rang out, echoing through the woods, filled with urgency. "Clara!" Sarah cried, reaching out as the vision began to fade. "We're here. We won't leave you." With newfound courage, Sarah stepped forward, standing her ground as the dark figure continued to loom closer. The entity seemed to flicker in and out of focus, a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and whispers. "Clara!" Sarah shouted again, her heart pounding. "We know you were scared. We're not going to let you suffer anymore." As the shadows coiled around her, Sarah focused on Clara's presence, drawing strength from the girl's spirit. "You're not alone anymore," she declared, feeling the energy surge through her. "You're free. You can move on." Suddenly, the dark figure let out a chilling roar, a sound that reverberated through the clearing like a thunderclap. The air grew cold, and Sarah felt a wave of dread wash over her. But in that moment, Clara's spirit glowed brightly, illuminating the darkness that surrounded them. "Together!" Clara's voice echoed, merging with the sound of the wind. "Together!" Sarah shouted back, feeling the power of Clara's spirit intertwine with her own. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." With a surge of adrenaline, Sarah pressed forward, the light from Clara's spirit growing stronger. The shadows seemed to recoil, twisting away from the warmth of the light. The dark figure wavered, its shape becoming more indistinct. "Leave her alone!" Sarah cried, feeling a newfound strength within her. "You can't hurt her anymore." In response, the dark entity writhed, its form collapsing in on itself as Clara's spirit surged forward, illuminating the clearing with a radiant glow. The whispers in the air intensified, morphing from haunting cries into a chorus of relief and release. "Help me! Let me go!" Clara's voice echoed, filling the night with a sense of liberation. As the shadows receded, the entity let out a final roar, the sound morphing into a wail of despair before it vanished completely, swallowed by the light. The air grew still, and for a moment, an overwhelming sense of peace enveloped the clearing. "Did we do it?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper as they stood, breathless and trembling. "I think we did," Sarah replied, her heart racing as she turned to the spot where Clara had stood moments before. The glow of her spirit lingered, brightening the darkness that once enveloped them. "Clara!" Sarah called out, her heart filled with hope. "Are you free?" In response, the light flickered and began to dim, but a sense of warmth washed over them, a gentle embrace that filled the clearing. "Thank you," Clara's voice echoed softly, a final whisper carried by the wind. As the last remnants of her spirit faded away, Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air lifted, replaced by an overwhelming feeling of liberation. Clara was free. Together, they stood in silence, the woods now calm and still, a sense of closure wrapping around them like a warm blanket. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her heart swelling with emotion. "Clara is finally at peace." As they made their way back through the woods, the night sky glittered above them, stars shining like beacons of hope. They had confronted the darkness, and in doing so, had given Clara the freedom she had long sought. "Let's go home," her mother said, her voice steady as they walked side by side. "Yeah, let's go home," Sarah agreed, her heart lightening with every step. They had faced their fears and uncovered the truth, and now it was time to carry Clara's memory with them, a reminder of the strength that lay within the bonds of love and friendship. As they reached the edge of the woods, Sarah glanced back one last time, feeling a sense of gratitude for the journey they had undertaken. Clara's spirit would always be a part of them, a guardian watching over them from the shadows, forever free. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Let's begin the next story. It started innocently enough, small, almost imperceptible moments that anyone else would have brushed aside without a second thought. But for Adrian, they lingered. The feeling, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his skin. It was the kind of sensation that you tried to rationalize, dismiss as nothing more than an overactive imagination, a product of the mind playing tricks. Except this feeling refused to fade. Adrian had lived alone in his small suburban house for a few years now, after inheriting the property from his late uncle. It was a cozy place, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, with a garden out back and a thick line of trees that bordered the yard. From the outside, it was picture perfect. Inside, it was home, his refuge from the world. But lately, it didn't feel like a refuge at all. It felt like something or someone was there with him. At first, it was the faint sounds that piqued his attention. A floorboard creaking in the middle of the night, the soft rustle of what he assumed was the wind, even though the windows were closed. He tried to ignore it, attributing the noises to the house settling or to some natural cause. Houses made noise after all, but as the days passed, the noises became harder to ignore, and with them came the distinct sensation of being watched. It started while he was working. Adrian was a freelance graphic designer, often spending long hours at his desk late into the night, crafting digital landscapes and designs for his clients. His office was in the back of the house, with a large window overlooking the garden. It was a peaceful view, especially at night, when the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across the yard. That night, as he worked, he felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the room. Nothing. The office was just as it always was. His desk, the shelves lined with books and equipment, the faint glow of his computer screen. He shook his head and turned back to his work, convincing himself it was nothing. But the sensation didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. It wasn't until a few minutes later, when he glanced out the window, that he saw it movement. A figure, or perhaps a shadow, darting between the trees. Adrian froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He blinked, trying to focus his eyes on the dark garden. There was nothing there now, just the swaying branches in the breeze. Had it been a trick of the light? Or had someone really been out there, watching him? He stood up, moving cautiously toward the window, his breath catching in his throat. He pressed his face close to the glass, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. Still nothing, but the feeling didn't leave him. If anything, it grew stronger. Adrian turned away from the window, retreating back to his desk. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m. He shut down his computer, deciding to call it a night. As he made his way to his bedroom, the sensation of being watched followed him, like an unwelcome shadow trailing just out of sight. The following morning, Adrian awoke groggy and unsettled. The events of the previous night lingered in his mind like a stubborn fog. Though he told himself that it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on him, the eerie feeling remained, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He went about his morning routine, hoping a cup of strong coffee would snap him out of his unease. The kitchen was bathed in soft morning light, the familiar smells of fresh brew filling the air. As he sat at the small dining table, scrolling through his emails, his mind kept wandering back to the garden. He had left the blinds open, giving him a clear view of the yard, now drenched in sunlight. It looked perfectly normal, quiet, peaceful, and entirely unremarkable. No signs of intruders or shadows lurking between the trees. Adrian tried to brush off the unease, convincing himself it was just a result of too many late nights and not enough sleep. But as he rose to rinse his mug in the sink, something caught his attention. The back door, which led out to the garden, was unlocked. He distinctly remembered locking it the night before. He always did, especially after the strange sensations he had been experiencing. Adrian frowned, reaching for the lock and sliding it into place. Maybe he had just forgotten in his tired state, but the moment felt off. Shrugging it off, he turned away, trying to shake the growing sense of dread that had settled in his chest. As the day progressed, little things began to feel wrong, small details in his surroundings that Adrian couldn't explain. When he returned to his office to resume work, he noticed his desk chair was slightly askew, as if it had been moved during the night. He had left it perfectly tucked under the desk when he went to bed. Later, while taking a break to grab lunch, he noticed a framed photograph on the living room mantel was tilted at an odd angle. He straightened it absent-mindedly, but as soon as he did, he felt a chill creep up his spine. Had it been like that before? It was the kind of small imperfection he usually would have noticed right away, especially since the photograph was one of his favorites, a picture of him and his parents from a family vacation years ago. Now, it felt strangely foreign, as if something had disturbed it. By the afternoon, the feeling had grown impossible to ignore. Each subtle anomaly tugged at his attention, pulling him into a state of heightened alertness. The locked door, the moved chair, the crooked photo. It was all adding up to something, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The sensation of being watched had returned, stronger than ever, lingering in the corners of his vision, just out of reach. Deciding he needed some fresh air, Adrian grabbed his jacket and stepped outside into the garden. The crisp autumn breeze swept over him, rustling the leaves of the trees that bordered his yard. He walked along the garden path, trying to clear his head, but the feeling of unease followed him, clinging to his every step. As he approached the trees at the back of the yard, he paused. The spot where he had seen movement the night before looked different in the daylight. Less ominous, but no less unsettling. He stared into the dense line of trees, half expecting to see someone step out from the shadows. But the garden remained still and silent. With a sigh, Adrian turned back toward the house, shaking his head. He was being paranoid. There was no one there. It was all just his mind playing tricks on him. But just as he was about to head inside, something else caught his eye. Near the base of the garden fence, partially obscured by the fallen leaves, was a footprint. Adrian crouched down to inspect it more closely. It was faint, almost like it had been made some time ago, but it was unmistakably there. A single footprint pressed into the earth, larger than his own. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been outside since the previous afternoon, and no one else should have been in the garden. But there it was, clear as day. The sense of being watched suddenly felt overwhelming. He stood up quickly, scanning the yard again, his breath catching in his throat. There was no one there. The garden was empty, just as it had been all morning. But the footprint told a different story. Someone had been there recently. Adrian backed away from the fence, his mind racing. Who could have been in his garden, and why? He hurried back inside, locking the door behind him and pulling the curtains shut. His house no longer felt safe. It felt exposed, vulnerable. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to start. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Adrian felt the weight of the unseen eyes again, watching, waiting. Adrian sat in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. The news played in the background, but he wasn't paying attention. His mind was consumed by the footprint he'd found in the garden. It had rattled him more than he cared to admit. For the rest of the day, he had stayed inside, avoiding the windows, checking and rechecking the locks on all the doors. The sense of being watched lingered like a shadow he couldn't shake. As night fell, the house grew eerily quiet. The usual comforting hum of the city seemed distant, as if muffled by some unseen force. Adrian's anxiety spiked. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made him jump. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep like this. Something was wrong, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Determined to get to the bottom of the strange occurrences, Adrian decided to investigate further. He grabbed a flashlight and his phone, mentally preparing himself to search the garden again. But this time, he wouldn't just inspect the fence. He had to be thorough. There was no room for dismissing these oddities any longer. Stepping outside, the cold night air hit him immediately, chilling him to the bone. The garden, which had seemed peaceful during the day, now felt oppressive under the cover of darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom as Adrian walked the perimeter of the yard, his eyes scanning the ground for more footprints or any sign of an intruder. At first, everything seemed normal, just the usual scattered leaves, the faint scent of earth, and the distant hum of traffic. But as he neared the spot where he had found the footprint earlier, His heart skipped a beat. There, partially hidden under the leaves, was another footprint. This one was fresher, clearer. Someone had definitely been here again. Adrian's breath hitched as he followed the trail. There were more prints now, leading from the back fence toward the house. Each step he took felt heavier, his pulse quickening as he realized the tracks stopped near his bedroom window. He stood frozen for a moment, his flashlight illuminating the spot where the footprints ended. A deep sense of dread washed over him. Whoever had been there wasn't just passing through. They had come right up to his house, stood by his window, and watched him. The idea of someone lurking so close, unseen in the dark, sent chills down his spine. Backing away slowly, Adrian's mind raced. Who could it be? And why? He hadn't made any enemies, had no recent visitors or conflicts that might explain such behavior. The thought of calling the police crossed his mind. But what would he say? That he found footprints in his garden? They would think he was overreacting, or worse, imagining things. But he wasn't imagining it. The evidence was right there, clear as day. Returning inside, Adrian locked the door again and shut all the blinds, his paranoia at an all-time high. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to begin. The rational part of him tried to explain it away. It could have been a neighbor, or maybe even a delivery person who got confused. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The unease he had been feeling, the subtle changes in the house, someone was watching him. As he sat in the dimly lit living room, trying to piece together what little information he had, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He flinched, his nerves shot, before grabbing it to check the message. It was from Emily, an old friend he hadn't spoken to in months. "Hey, long time no talk. You free for a call?" Adrian stared at the screen, feeling a wave of relief. Maybe a distraction was exactly what he needed. He called her back, grateful for the chance to talk to someone familiar, someone who could pull him out of this spiraling anxiety. "Adrian, wow, it's been ages." Emily's voice was warm and full of energy, the complete opposite of how Adrian felt. "Yeah, it has. How have you been?" They chatted for a while, catching up on life. But as the conversation wound down, Adrian felt the need to tell her about the strange things happening at his house. Maybe she would have some insight, or at least help him feel less crazy. "So, something weird's been happening here," Adrian started, explaining the strange sensations, the footprint, and the general sense of being watched. Emily listened intently, but when he finished, her voice turned serious. "Adrian, that's really unsettling. Are you sure it's not someone messing with you?" "I don't know," Adrian replied, feeling a bit sheepish. "I thought maybe it was just my imagination at first, but now, I'm not so sure." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Emily spoke again, her tone had shifted. "Have you checked your security cameras?" Adrian blinked. He didn't have security cameras. It had never seemed necessary. His neighborhood was quiet, safe, nothing ever happened here. But now, he was seriously regretting that decision. "I don't have any," he admitted, feeling a pang of embarrassment. "Adrian, you need to get some. Like yesterday. If someone's creeping around your house, you need to know who it is." She was right, of course. He couldn't just sit here, waiting for something else to happen. He had to take control of the situation. After their call ended, Adrian immediately went online, searching for security cameras. He ordered a set that could be installed around the house the next day, feeling a small sense of relief that he was doing something proactive. But as he closed his laptop and prepared for bed, the unease returned, stronger than ever. That night, as he lay in bed, every sound seemed amplified. The wind outside, the faint creaks of the house settling. Everything made his heart race. He kept his eyes fixed on the bedroom window, half expecting to see a shadowy figure standing just outside. But the window remained dark, offering no clues to the mystery that had begun to consume him. As sleep finally overtook him, Adrian dreamed of footsteps in the night, of eyes watching from the shadows, and of a presence that grew ever closer. The next morning arrived with a sense of dread that hung over Adrian like a dark cloud. He had barely slept, the anxiety of the night before still gnawing at him. He sat up in bed, eyes heavy with fatigue, and glanced at the window where the footprints had ended. The thought of someone lurking outside as he slept made his skin crawl. Determined not to let fear control him, Adrian made a plan. The security cameras he'd ordered were due to arrive today, and he would spend the afternoon setting them up. Until then, he resolved to keep himself busy and not dwell too much on the strange occurrences. Easier said than done. After a quick breakfast, Adrian walked into the garden to check if the footprints were still there. Sure enough, the trail remained, leading to his window like some kind of silent warning. As he crouched down to examine them again, something new caught his attention. A strange indentation in the grass beside the window. It looked like someone had knelt down, as if they had been watching him closely from that very spot. Adrian's stomach turned. He quickly straightened up and returned to the house, his mind racing with questions. Who was this person? Why were they so intent on spying on him? And, most importantly, how long had this been going on? Unable to shake the unsettling thoughts, Adrian spent the morning aimlessly pacing around the house. Every noise, whether from the street outside or within the walls, set him on edge. The sensation of being watched felt stronger now, as if the unseen presence had followed him indoors. Around midday, the doorbell rang, and Adrian jumped, his heart racing. He hurried to answer, half expecting some ominous visitor, but it was just the delivery driver dropping off his security cameras. Relief washed over him as he signed for the package and quickly brought it inside. He spent the next few hours setting up the cameras. One at the front door, another at the back, and a couple around the perimeter of the house, especially near the window where the footprints had ended. He meticulously adjusted the angles to ensure that every blind spot was covered, determined not to miss anything. Once everything was installed, Adrian connected the system to his phone, allowing him to monitor the feed in real time. For the first time in days, he felt a small sense of control returning. If the mysterious watcher came back, he would catch them in the act. As evening fell, Adrian kept a close eye on the live footage from the cameras. The daylight slowly faded, casting long shadows across the garden, and the familiar sense of unease crept back in. He couldn't stop himself from imagining someone out there, waiting for darkness to fall so they could resume their silent surveillance. By nightfall, Adrian was glued to his phone, watching the camera feeds intently. He sat on the couch, his nerves frayed, as each second dragged by an agonizing suspense. Nothing. The garden was empty, the street quiet, just like any other night. But still, that heavy feeling of being watched lingered, as if the cameras weren't enough to deter whoever, or whatever, was stalking him. Hours passed, and just when Adrian was starting to think that maybe he had overreacted, his phone buzzed with a notification. Movement detected. His pulse spiked as he frantically opened the camera app. The footage from the backyard camera came into focus, and his heart dropped. There, barely visible in the shadows near the garden fence, was a figure. It stood motionless, almost blending in with the darkness, but the camera had caught it. Adrian's breath hitched as he watched the figure remain completely still for several agonizing seconds. Then slowly, it moved just a slight shift, as if it knew it had been spotted. And then, in a swift motion, the figure disappeared out of the frame, vanishing into the night. Adrian's hand shook as he replayed the footage over and over. The figure was too far away to make out any details, no face, no recognizable features, but it was real. Someone had been there, watching, just as he had feared. His stomach churned with fear and frustration. He had proof now, but what good was it if he couldn't identify the person? And what did they want? Adrian spent the rest of the night wide awake, unable to relax. Every time he glanced at the camera feed, his eyes searched for any sign of movement. But the figure didn't return, leaving Adrian alone with his mounting paranoia and unanswered questions. The next morning, Adrian reached out to the local authorities, providing them with the footage. They promised to look into it, but the lack of any clear suspect left them with little to work with. The officer he spoke to seemed sympathetic but skeptical, as if he wasn't fully convinced that the situation was as dire as Adrian made it out to be. Days passed, and despite his best efforts to stay vigilant, the sense of being watched never faded. The figure from the footage haunted his thoughts, appearing in his mind's eye whenever he closed his eyes. The cameras offered some comfort, but they weren't enough to erase the creeping fear that had taken hold of him. Then, one night, as Adrian lay in bed, he heard something that sent chills down his spine. a faint, almost imperceptible tapping sound coming from the direction of his bedroom window. He sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed his phone to check the camera feed. But the garden was empty. Nothing moved. And yet, the sound continued, a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the glass. Adrian's hands shook as he slowly got out of bed and approached the window. The tapping stopped as soon as he neared it. He stood frozen, staring out into the dark garden, his breath fogging up the cold glass. There was no one there, at least not that he could see, but the feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. Suddenly his phone buzzed again. Another movement alert. Adrian's heart raced as he checked the camera feed, expecting to see the shadowy figure from before. But what he saw made his blood run cold. The figure was back, standing directly under his bedroom window, staring up at him. Its face, though still obscured by shadow, seemed to be turned directly toward him. Adrian stumbled backward, his mind racing. This wasn't just a random stalker. Whoever, or whatever, this was, it wanted him to know that it was there. Watching. Waiting. With shaking hands, Adrian dialed the police once more, his voice barely steady as he explained what was happening. But as he spoke, the figure on the camera feed vanished again, melting into the night like a ghost. The police arrived shortly after Adrian's frantic call, but as expected, by the time they made their way through the garden, there was no sign of the figure. They combed through the yard, checked the perimeter, and reviewed the footage Adrian had captured. The grainy image of the shadowy figure under his window was enough to make them take the situation seriously. But still, there was little they could do. The officer who seemed the most sympathetic offered a bit of reassurance. "We'll keep an eye out in the area," he said, his flashlight cutting through the dim light of the yard. "Make sure you keep those cameras running. And if you see anything else, call us." It was all they could offer, a promise to patrol the neighborhood and the vague hope that the cameras might capture something useful. But as the police cruiser drove away, Adrian was left standing in his front doorway, the unsettling quiet of the night pressing in on him. The figure had been there, under his window, staring up at him, and yet it felt as though he had imagined the entire thing. That night, sleep was impossible. Adrian lay awake in bed, eyes darting to the window every few minutes, expecting to see the figure again, half hidden in the shadows. But the hours ticked by, and nothing happened. The house remained eerily quiet, and the camera feed stayed still. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left him. By morning, Adrian felt hollowed out by exhaustion and paranoia. The footsteps, the figure, the tapping. It was all blurring together, a nightmare that he couldn't wake from. He needed answers, and more than that, he needed to understand who was tormenting him. As the days passed, Adrian's attempts to lead a normal life became futile. Every time he left his house, he felt eyes on him, even in the most mundane places, the grocery store, the park, even walking down the street. It wasn't just the figure at night. It was as if someone or something was constantly watching his every move. One evening, Adrian sat down at his dining room table with a glass of whiskey, trying to steady his nerves. The cameras had been quiet for days, no movement alerts, no ominous figures. Yet the tension in the air remained. He took a long sip and glanced around the room. His gaze settled on the bookshelf in the corner, specifically the framed family portrait on the top shelf. Adrian's heart sank. There was something off about the photo, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it at first. He stood up and walked over, lifting the frame from the shelf. It was a photo he'd had for years, taken at a family reunion. His parents, his brother, his cousin, they were all there smiling in the bright sunlight. But now, as he studied it closely, a chill ran down his spine. There was someone else in the photo. Adrian's eyes widened in shock. He held the frame closer, his hands trembling. Standing off to the side, barely noticeable at first glance, was a figure, a dark, shadowy outline, so faint it almost blended into the background. It wasn't part of the original photo. Adrian was sure of it. He had looked at this picture countless times, and there had never been anyone else in it. But now, there they were, a figure lurking just beyond the edge of the family, like an uninvited guest. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the figure. It was the same figure from the camera footage, the one that had been standing outside his window. Adrian could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around him as he realized the implications. This wasn't just someone watching him. This presence, this figure, was somehow inserting itself into his life, into his memories. Adrian dropped the frame, and it hit the floor with a loud crack, the glass shattering. He staggered backward, gasping for breath, his mind racing with questions. How is this even possible? What kind of person or thing could manipulate a photograph like that? He backed away from the broken frame, stumbling toward the kitchen in a blind panic. The whiskey bottle sat on the counter, half empty, and he grabbed it, downing a swig to steady himself. But the alcohol did nothing to calm his fraying nerves. His thoughts were spiraling out of control, and the walls of the house seemed to close in around him. Just then, his phone buzzed on the counter. Adrian froze, staring at the screen with wide eyes. Another movement alert from the cameras. He didn't want to look. Every instinct told him to leave the house, to run, to get away from whatever was haunting him. But he couldn't resist. With trembling hands, he unlocked his phone and opened the camera app. The backyard feed loaded, and Adrian's blood ran cold. The figure was back, standing in the exact same spot as before, right under his window. But this time, it wasn't looking up at him. It was staring directly at the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there watching, waiting. A sickening realization dawned on him. It wasn't just observing him. It was letting him know it was there. It wanted to be seen. The figure slowly raised a hand, pointing directly at the camera lens, and then it vanished once again, melting into the darkness. Adrian dropped his phone, his entire body shaking with fear. The figure was taunting him, playing some twisted game that he couldn't understand. It was no longer about being watched. It was about something far more terrifying. Whatever was haunting him wasn't just a physical presence. It was invading his life, his mind, his very sense of reality. He needed help. But from who? Adrian grabbed his phone again, his shaking fingers dialing the number of the officer who had handled his case. He couldn't stay in the house any longer. He needed someone to see what was happening, to validate the nightmare he was living. The phone rang, and after what felt like an eternity, the officer answered. Adrian's voice was frantic, barely coherent, as he explained what had just happened. But before the officer could respond, Adrian's phone buzzed again. A notification from the cameras. Movement detected. This time, from inside the house. Adrian's blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned around, his eyes scanning the empty room. But deep down, he knew what he would find. He wasn't alone anymore. Adrian's pulse thundered in his ears as his eyes darted around the living room, heart hammering in his chest. The notification still lingered on his phone screen. Movement detected inside the house, the words burning into his mind. Every sound felt amplified in the silence. The soft creak of floorboards, the faint rustling of air through the vents. He backed into the kitchen, scanning the room for anything he could use as a weapon. His hand trembled as it grasped the handle of a large kitchen knife. It wasn't much, but it offered a tiny sense of control in a situation that was spiraling far beyond anything rational. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. He glanced at the camera feed again, flipping through the views. Living room, hallway, bedroom. Nothing seemed out of place. But the nagging feeling of being watched persisted, stronger than ever. It was as if the very walls of his home were closing in, suffocating him with their oppressive stillness. Adrian's breathing was shallow as he edged toward the hallway, knife gripped tightly in his hand. His footsteps were cautious, each one feeling louder than the last. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows, every corner hiding potential danger, every darkened room a gateway to something unknown. As he reached the threshold of the living room, he heard it, a soft creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floorboards above. The sound came from upstairs, his bedroom. Adrian's heart leapt into his throat, and for a brief moment, he considered running, fleeing the house, and never looking back. But something held him in place. This was his home. Whatever was inside, whatever had invaded his sanctuary, he had to face it. He ascended the stairs slowly, each step a deliberate and careful movement, the knife held in front of him like a shield. His mind raced with possibilities. Had someone broken in? Was this all just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress? But deep down, he knew better. This was no ordinary intruder. Reaching the top of the stairs, he paused, listening intently. The sound had stopped, but the air felt different, charged with a heavy tension. His bedroom door stood ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through. He couldn't see anything from where he stood, but the cold, unsettling feeling gnawed at his insides. He nudged the door open with the tip of the knife. The room was empty. At least it looked that way. Adrian's eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding spot. The bed was untouched, the curtains still, the closet door slightly ajar. But nothing seemed out of place. He stepped further into the room, scanning it more carefully. That's when he noticed something, a strange, almost imperceptible imprint on the carpet, near the foot of his bed. Footprints. His blood froze. They weren't his. Adrian crouched down, his breath shaky, staring at the prints. They were faint but distinct enough to send a chill through him. Small, as if made by a child, leading from the window toward the bed. He followed the trail with his eyes, dread building in the pit of his stomach. Then he saw it. On the wall above the headboard, scrawled in what looked like dirt or dust, were words. Jagged, hurried, and unsettlingly familiar. "I see you." Adrian staggered backward, his mind reeling. The handwriting, it was the same as what he had seen on the note from days before. The same as the figure that had appeared in his family portrait. The realization hit him like a freight train. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a stalker or a prankster. This thing, this presence, was connected to him on a deeper level, something far more personal and sinister. Suddenly, a sharp creak broke the silence, and Adrian spun around, knife raised. His bedroom door, which he had left wide open, was now closing slowly, as if pushed by an unseen hand. The soft sound of the latch clicking into place was deafening in the quiet room. He was trapped. His breath came in ragged gasps as panic gripped him. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and oppressive. He glanced around wildly, half expecting the figure to materialize out of the shadows at any moment. Adrian's phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, he pulled it from his pocket, eyes widening in disbelief as he read the message. "Don't look behind you." His heart nearly stopped. A cold, icy sensation washed over him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He could feel it. Something or someone was standing right behind him. The room seemed to grow colder, and Adrian's breath became visible in the frigid air. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, but his body wouldn't obey. Slowly, ever so slowly, he turned his head. There, standing at the foot of his bed, was the figure. It wasn't a shadow this time. It was clear, detailed, almost human, but its features were distorted, its skin pale and stretched tight over a gaunt frame. Its eyes dark, hollow pits bored into him, and a twisted, unnatural smile crept across its face. Adrian's scream caught in his throat as the figure took a step closer, its hand reaching out toward him. Suddenly, the door behind him burst open, and Adrian stumbled backward, his grip on the knife slipping. He turned to see a shadowy blur pass by, knocking him off balance as it moved with unnatural speed. The air was thick with the sensation of movement, but when he looked around again, the figure was gone. The room was empty once more. Adrian collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, his body trembling violently. The message on his phone still glowed in the dark, taunting him. "Don't look behind you." But he had looked, and now he knew the horrifying truth. The figure wasn't just watching him. It was inside his house. Adrian sat motionless on the floor, the terror from what he had just witnessed coursing through his veins like ice. The figure was inside his home. No longer a distant threat, but something that had breached his sanctuary. His mind scrambled to process what was happening, but there were no rational explanations. The thing he saw wasn't human, and it was far from gone. His phone lay next to him on the floor, the screen black now, but the chilling message echoed in his thoughts. "Don't look behind you." What if it came back? What if it never left? He forced himself to stand, his legs shaky and weak beneath him. The knife was still on the floor, but it felt useless now, like a toy in the face of something so monstrous. His breath was ragged as he scanned the room once more. The footprints on the carpet seemed to mock him, leading nowhere, yet telling him all he needed to know. He wasn't safe here. His instincts screamed to leave, to run as far from this house as he could, but another part of him, a darker part, urged him to stay, to face whatever it was. He needed answers. He bolted toward the door, pushing it open with a force that rattled the hinges, and stumbled into the hallway. The house was still, eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sense of being watched hadn't left him. Every step he took down the hallway, he could feel unseen eyes tracking his movements, lurking in the shadows. His skin prickled, and every noise, no matter how small, made his heart leap into his throat. Adrian headed toward the stairs, desperate to escape the suffocating sense of dread that seemed to cling to him. He half ran, half tripped down the steps, only stopping when he reached the front door. He fumbled with the lock, fingers trembling so badly that it took him several tries to turn the latch. Finally, he wrenched the door open and stepped out onto the front porch, gasping for the cool night air. But even outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following his every move. The street was empty, dark except for the occasional glow of a street lamp. The world outside felt indifferent to his nightmare. His neighbors were likely asleep, unaware of the terror unfolding just a few feet away. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He couldn't stay out here forever, but the thought of going back inside sent waves of nausea through him. The figure, whatever it was still in there, waiting. Just then his phone buzzed again. His heart dropped. He pulled it from his pocket with trembling hands and glanced at the screen. Another message. "I'm still watching." Adrian's breath hitched, and his hand flew to his mouth in disbelief. His fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to throw the phone as far as he could, but he couldn't. It was his only link to whatever was happening. But then a second message followed immediately. "Come back inside." He nearly dropped the phone. His hands shook uncontrollably now, and he backed away from the house, eyes wide with fear. The front door, which had been ajar, began to creak shut slowly, as if pulled by an invisible force. This couldn't be real. His mind refused to accept it. He was losing control of everything. His home, his sanity, his very sense of reality. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling. Adrian spun around, eyes darting to the shadows at the edge of the yard. His breathing quickened as his gaze landed on the figure standing at the end of his driveway. It was the same one, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to devour the darkness around them. It stood completely still, its eerie smile etched into its face, as if mocking him. Adrian's body froze in place, paralyzed by fear. The knife, he had left it inside. Not that it would have made a difference. The figure didn't move. It just stared, unblinking, its gaze boring into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs refused to obey. It was as if the figure held him captive with its very presence. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure took a step forward. Just one. That single movement snapped Adrian out of his trance, and without thinking, he turned and bolted down the street. His feet pounded against the pavement, lungs burning as he ran faster than he ever had in his life. He didn't look back, couldn't look back, for fear that the figure would be right behind him, closing the distance with every second. He didn't stop running until he reached the park several blocks away. He collapsed onto a bench, gasping for air, his entire body trembling from exhaustion and fear. For a brief moment, he thought he might be safe. The open space of the park offered some relief, a sense that he could see danger coming from a distance. But that sense of relief was short-lived. His phone buzzed again. Adrian's heart sank as he hesitantly glanced at the screen. "You can't run from me." He stared at the message, his mind racing. He wasn't safe, not here, not anywhere. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the normal rules of reality. It could find him no matter where he went. His phone buzzed again, and this time a picture appeared on the screen. It was a photo of him, sitting on the bench, right where he was now. The angle suggested it had been taken from the shadows at the edge of the park. He looked around wildly, but the figure wasn't visible. His phone buzzed a final time. "Look behind you." Adrian's blood ran cold. He didn't want to. He couldn't. But something compelled him to do it anyway. Some twisted need to confront the terror head-on. With a pounding heart, he slowly turned his head. There, standing just a few feet behind him, was the figure. It smiled. Adrian's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure standing just behind him. The air around him seemed to thicken, as though the atmosphere itself was bending to the creature's presence. Its pale face was bathed in shadow, yet its hollow, dark eyes gleamed with a malicious intent. The smile, unnatural and grotesque, stretched wider as if it were feeding off Adrian's fear. Instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. He tried to make sense of what he was seeing, but no rational explanation existed. This wasn't just an intruder or a figment of his imagination. It was something far worse, something otherworldly, existing beyond the laws of nature. The figure didn't move. It stood there, motionless, like a predator toying with its prey, knowing full well that it had control. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud in his ears. He knew he had to act, do something, anything to escape. He forced his body to respond, to snap out of the paralytic fear that gripped him. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Adrian jumped up from the bench and sprinted toward the park's exit. He didn't look back. He couldn't risk it. Every ounce of energy went into fleeing the scene, the distant sound of his own frantic breathing drowning out the eerie silence behind him. As he ran, the world around him blurred into an incomprehensible haze. The empty streets, the lampposts, even the night sky seemed to bend and warp, as though reality itself was losing its grip. He felt like he was running through a nightmare, each step pulling him deeper into a realm where nothing made sense and the rules of time and space no longer applied. Adrian finally reached his street, breathless and soaked in sweat. His muscles burned, his lungs begged for air, but he kept moving, terrified that the figure could appear at any moment, ready to claim him. The house loomed ahead, dark and unwelcoming, but it was his only option. As he reached his front door, he fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped them on the porch. A soft laugh echoed behind him, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down his spine. He glanced over his shoulder, heart hammering in his chest. The figure stood at the end of his driveway, just watching. Adrian's fingers scrambled to pick up the keys, his movements frantic as the figure started to move, one slow, deliberate step after another. His hands finally found the key, and he jammed it into the lock, pushing the door open just as the figure neared the front steps. Slamming the door shut behind him, Adrian pressed his back against it, chest heaving with exertion. He half expected the figure to burst through, to finish whatever twisted game it had started, but nothing happened. The silence pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. For several moments, he stood there, his breath shallow and ragged. Slowly, he slid down to the floor, hugging his knees to his chest. He was safe, for now, but a sense of dread still clung to him like a heavy fog. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound shattering the stillness of the house. Reluctantly, Adrian pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Another message. "You can't hide." He closed his eyes, trying to block out the rising tide of panic that threatened to overwhelm him. He didn't know what this thing was or why it had chosen him, but he knew one thing for certain: it wouldn't stop until it had him. He couldn't escape it. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft creaking sound coming from the hallway. Adrian's eyes snapped open, his entire body tensing. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Something or someone was moving in the house. He held his breath, listening intently as the creaking grew louder. His pulse quickened. He hadn't seen the figure enter the house, but that didn't mean it hadn't found another way in. Slowly, Adrian rose to his feet, moving as quietly as possible. The creaking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. He glanced around, unsure of where to go or what to do. He couldn't just sit and wait for whatever was out there to find him. He made his way toward the kitchen, his mind racing through his limited options. His phone still clutched tightly in his hand. He dialed the police, but the call wouldn't connect. The line crackled with static before cutting off completely. A cold wave of realization washed over him. He was truly alone in this. Suddenly, a new sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from upstairs. Tap, tap, tap. Adrian froze, his skin crawling. He recognized that sound. It was the same tapping he had heard days before, late at night when he'd thought it was nothing more than the house settling. But now he knew better. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if beckoning him to follow. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the hallway, right outside his bedroom door. He didn't want to go upstairs, but he couldn't stay where he was. His eyes darted to the kitchen drawer where he had earlier stashed a knife. He grabbed it with shaking hands, the cold metal offering little comfort against the terror gnawing at him. With every step, the tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if the source knew he was approaching. When Adrian reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. He took a deep breath and began to climb, each footfall heavier than the last. The upstairs hallway stretched out before him, dark and foreboding. At the end of the hallway, just outside his bedroom door, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Footprints. Fresh, wet footprints leading from his bedroom door, stopping just a few feet away from where he stood. The tapping stopped. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the knife tighter. He could feel the presence nearby, watching, waiting. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to confront it, but he knew he had no choice. As he took another step forward, the air grew thick with tension, and the temperature dropped sharply. His breath came out in frosty puffs, hanging in the still air. The house had never felt more oppressive. Then, without warning, the bedroom door creaked open. The door creaked open slowly, almost as if it were being pushed by an invisible hand. Adrian's heart raced as he stood frozen on the threshold of the darkened hallway, the knife clutched tightly in his trembling fingers. The dim light from the end of the corridor barely illuminated the room beyond, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. Adrian's instincts screamed at him to flee, to run from this oppressive darkness that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. But something held him there, rooted in place, as if he were drawn by an unseen force. He could feel the coldness radiating from the open doorway, a chill that sank deep into his bones. With a surge of adrenaline, he stepped forward, his breath hitching in his throat as he approached the threshold of his own bedroom. The air was thick with a palpable tension, and he could feel it wrapping around him, squeezing tighter with every passing second. The footprints led directly into his room, their wetness stark against the hardwood floor. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky but louder than he intended. It echoed back to him, swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung in the air. There was no response, only the quiet rustling of fabric. Was it a whisper? Filling the darkness. He hesitated, heart pounding so loudly he feared it would burst from his chest. Every instinct told him to retreat, but he had come too far to turn back now. Steeling himself, he stepped over the threshold, knife held out in front of him like a feeble shield against the unknown. The room was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the corners, making it impossible to discern what lay within. Adrian scanned the room, taking in every detail. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled and pushed aside, as if someone had been roused from a deep slumber. Clothes lay strewn across the floor, and the closet door stood slightly ajar, dark and foreboding. His breath caught as he noticed the mirror across the room. It reflected back the scene, but something was off. The reflection appeared distorted, twisted, an echo of reality that sent a shiver down his spine. He could see the shadows moving, swirling like smoke, creeping ever closer to him. Ignoring the creeping dread, Adrian took a step further into the room, adrenaline propelling him forward. The wet footprints were now more pronounced against the wooden floor, glistening ominously. They didn't lead to any specific destination, but seemed to move in a chaotic pattern, as if whatever had left them was still here, still moving. As he turned to face the closet, the door swung open, revealing nothing but darkness within. The space felt alive, pulsing with an unsettling energy that sent a chill down his spine. Adrian took a cautious step forward, the knife poised in his grip, ready for whatever might leap out at him. "Come on," he muttered to himself, voice barely above a whisper. "Face me." Just as he reached for the closet door, a loud thud echoed through the house, shaking the very foundation. Adrian jumped, heart racing as he spun around to face the source of the noise. It came from the hallway, a deep, resonating sound that felt like a warning. He felt the urge to run, to escape this suffocating atmosphere, but his feet remained glued to the spot. The thud came again, followed by a slow, deliberate scrape. It was as if something was dragging itself closer, inch by agonizing inch. Adrian turned back to the closet, knowing he had to face whatever lurked within. He pulled the door open wider, half expecting a figure to leap out at him. Instead, he was met with a haunting silence and nothing but empty darkness staring back. Suddenly, the lights flickered above him, casting erratic shadows that danced wildly across the walls. Just as the brightness dimmed, Adrian caught a glimpse of something shifting within the closet, a shadow slipping just out of sight. His heart raced as he lunged forward, thrusting the knife into the darkness. "Show yourself," he shouted, the sound echoing back at him in a mocking tone. But the only response was a low, throaty chuckle that reverberated around the room. Adrian stumbled back, his breath hitching in his throat. "What do you want?" he shouted, feeling small and helpless against the unseen entity that toyed with him. The answer came in the form of a whisper, cold and breathy, curling around his mind like a vine. "You invited me in?" Adrian's heart dropped as he tried to recall any moment that could have led to this nightmare. The nights of isolation, the fears that had crept into his thoughts. Had he truly invited this presence into his life? The fear was palpable, twisting like a knife in his gut. "Get out," he yelled, desperation clawing at his throat. He could feel the darkness thickening around him, closing in, suffocating him. He stumbled back, knocking over a lamp, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot, breaking the silence and sparking a flicker of hope. Maybe the noise would draw someone to him. Maybe someone would hear him and help. He rushed to the door, but as he turned to leave, the air shifted. The closet door slammed shut with a resounding bang, trapping him in the room. Adrian's heart raced as he turned back, only to be met by the figure now standing at the foot of his bed. It was a silhouette, its features obscured by the shadows, but he could feel its gaze piercing into him, drawing him closer, inviting him into the depths of despair. "No," Adrian breathed, shaking his head, stepping back. "I won't let you take me." The figure began to move, gliding across the floor toward him, each step deliberate and taunting. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of distorted voices echoing around him, filling his mind with darkness and despair. In that moment, Adrian felt the weight of despair settling in his chest, an overwhelming force pulling him down, threatening to swallow him whole. He was trapped, lost in a nightmare with no escape. But deep within, a flicker of defiance ignited. He wouldn't go down without a fight. With one last surge of adrenaline, Adrian lunged toward the door, gripping the knob with all his might. Adrian's heart thundered in his chest as he gripped the doorknob, the cold metal sending a shock through his hand. Panic surged within him, and he could feel the dark presence closing in, its energy crackling in the air like static electricity. The whispers surrounded him, wrapping around his mind like tendrils of smoke, each voice a cacophony of taunts and threats. "Let me out! Let me out!" he shouted, twisting the knob frantically, but it refused to budge. The door felt as solid as a brick wall, mocking him, and with each attempt, the darkness pressed closer, hungry and insatiable. The figure at the foot of the bed remained motionless, its silhouette sharp against the dim light, watching him with an intensity that made Adrian's skin crawl. The air thickened, weighing him down, and the whispers intensified, a relentless barrage of voices that echoed his fears. "Why won't you let me in?" one voice hissed, drawing near. "You called for me?" Adrian squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. "No, I never wanted this." he yelled, desperation clawing at him. But the voices only grew louder, more insistent, drowning him in their madness. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness before sputtering back to life. In that fleeting moment of blackness, Adrian felt a surge of resolve. This couldn't be the end. He had to break free, to reclaim his life from this malevolent force that had invaded his home. He stepped back from the door, turning to face the shadowy figure that loomed larger with every passing second. It was time to confront it. The knife still clutched in his hand felt heavy but comforting, a symbol of his determination. "Who are you?" Adrian shouted, his voice ringing out in defiance. "What do you want from me?" The figure's form shimmered, distorting in the light, and for a moment, Adrian thought he saw a face, a twisted reflection of himself. Eyes hollow and dark, mouth curled into a grin that sent chills racing down his spine. "I am what you fear," it replied, the voice echoing in a chorus of mockery. "I am the shadow of your doubt, the manifestation of your darkest secrets." Adrian felt the weight of its words bearing down on him, threatening to crush him under the enormity of his own guilt. He had tried to run from his fears, to ignore them, but they had only grown stronger in his silence. "No more," he declared, planting his feet firmly on the ground. "You don't own me." With a newfound strength, Adrian raised the knife, feeling the cool steel against his palm. The act felt empowering, a reclaiming of his agency. The figure recoiled slightly, shadows swirling around it like a storm, but it quickly regained its composure, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate menace. "You cannot fight me," it hissed, the voices melding into a single, unified tone. "I am a part of you, and you cannot escape your own reflection." Adrian's heart raced as he stared into the figure's eyes, feeling the coldness seep into his soul. It was right. It was a reflection of everything he feared and regretted, but he refused to let it consume him. "Then I will face you," he shouted, feeling the words resonate within him, igniting a fire he thought had long since extinguished. "I will not hide anymore." In that moment, he charged forward, knife held high, ready to confront the darkness that had haunted him. The figure lurched back, a mixture of surprise and rage flickering across its face. "You cannot defeat me," it shrieked, the cacophony of voices rising to a fever pitch. But Adrian pressed on, the knife glinting in the dim light. "Watch me," he shouted, plunging the blade into the darkness where the figure stood. To his shock, the knife met no resistance. It sliced through the air as though he were striking at smoke. The figure dissipated, shadows swirling and unraveling as Adrian's determination broke through the suffocating veil. He stumbled back, panting as he watched the darkness unravel around him. The whispers began to fade, replaced by a heavy silence, as the figure lost its form, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The oppressive weight that had filled the room lifted, and the shadows receded, leaving him standing alone in the flickering light. Adrian's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the truth. He had faced his fears, confronted the darkness within himself, and emerged victorious. But just as relief began to wash over him, he felt a sudden chill rush through the room. He turned slowly, heart pounding, and saw a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. The closet door creaked open slightly, and from within, a faint light began to pulse, casting eerie shadows along the walls. "Adrian," a voice whispered, soft and melodic, almost inviting. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as dread settled back into his chest. He stepped back, instinctively clutching the knife tighter. "No, get away from me." The voice grew stronger, more insistent. "You can't escape me. You've only just begun to unravel the truth." Adrian felt the ground beneath him tremble as the shadows thickened once more. It wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. As the light from the closet pulsed rhythmically, the whispers returned, wrapping around him like a shroud. "What do you want?" he shouted into the darkness, desperation creeping back into his voice. "Everything," the voice echoed back, reverberating through the very fabric of his being. "And I will take what is mine." With a final surge of energy, Adrian lunged toward the closet, the knife raised high. He wouldn't let the darkness win. Not this time. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe and like the video.